Welcome back again. Please comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now, and press the like button. I've gotten requests to keep a black screen on my videos to help you fall asleep, so let's try keeping the screen black the entire video. Let's get to it. The ranger peers over the Grand Canyon's south rim. Far below, a body lies contorted on a ledge. Next to him, a husband's voice is flat, practiced. She slipped. Wind scrapes the rock. Cameras click. Tourists keep a distance. He doesn't cry. He explains. And yet, this isn't his first tragedy. 2 decades earlier, another suicide sealed a Colorado home in silence. Accident, despair, or staging. What pattern hides in plain sight? To understand the fall, we need to go back to a Littleton kitchen, to the first gunshot that rewrote a family's history. Robert Spangler was good at being the man people trusted. On paper, he looked steady, radio professional, smooth voice, easy smile, competent at the tiny rituals of office life that create confidence. He remembered birthdays, liked controlled routines, and came off as a fixer. In a community like Littleton, Colorado, that kind of consistency reads as safety. He married Nancy in the 1960s. They built a suburban life with 2 children, David and Susan. From the outside, it felt ordinary. School pickups, weekend errands, small talk with neighbors. Inside, Nancy carried the weight of keeping things pleasant. The psychology of the moment is important. Image mattered to Robert. Reputation was not just a preference, it was currency. Under the surface, people noticed patterns that seemed minor at first, flirtations that crossed lines. Late nights he framed as work. He was charming, but the charm felt like strategy, deployed when needed, withheld when not. Friends later recalled a subtle control. How he would correct Nancy in public. How he pivoted conversations to keep himself centered. How he minimized any threat to his standing. By 1978, pressure had layered up. Money was not catastrophic, but it was tight. The marriage was strained. Affairs had eroded trust. Robert was entering a midlife corridor where status and escape often collide. He liked the image of being desired, respected, and in charge, yet he felt boxed in. Mortgage, expectations, a wife who knew too much, children who required attention he did not want to give. What stands out now in retrospect is that he cultivated multiple selves. At work, measured and reliable. With friends, affable and joking. At home, more exacting. Nancy wanted counseling. He wanted results without vulnerability. He would apologize, then repeat the behavior. Boundaries blurred, and in that blur, entitlement grows. If the facade is the true self, any threat to it becomes intolerable. They argued about fidelity, about money, about the future. Nancy began to assert more independence. Small acts at first, then firmer stances. The children, caught in the middle, felt the tension without fully understanding where it led. Meanwhile, Robert curated the outside narrative. He was trying. He was patient. He was misunderstood. The gap between his public self and private control widened. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. In this house, silence was imposed by a single decision, and then there was the morning phone call that would frame Nancy forever through someone else's words. The plan seemed simple: present tragedy as misfortune, let grief do the talking, and let the community fill in the blanks. But here is the twist. When a man survives too many tragedies, patterns start to speak, even decades later. The call came in just after morning rush. A calm male voice, controlled cadence, reporting a tragedy at his own address. He said he had come home and found his wife, sounding stunned but functional. Dispatch logged the basics, sent units, and noted something subtle. The caller followed his own story beats, volunteering details that usually have to be pulled. He mentioned depression. He mentioned arguments. He offered a framework before anyone stepped through the door. Officers entered a quiet Littleton home where breakfast dishes were stacked, where life looked paused, not broken. Nancy lay in the bedroom, a handgun near her hand, the tableau hinting at a self-inflicted shot. But the silence had more in it. Down the hall, they found David and Susan, each in separate rooms, each shot while in bed. A mother dead, 2 children dead, all in the place that should have kept them safe. The psychology of the moment is important. Investigators at the time often mapped family annihilation onto maternal breakdown, especially when a weapon was near the woman's body. Stress, private despair, domestic pressure were the working explanations. In that era, a scene like this often defaulted to a murder-suicide narrative if it looked neat, and this one did, at first glance, look neat. But the details did not sit right, even then, once they were collected. Pillow fibers where they should not be. The angle of Nancy's wound, inconsistent with the way her arm lay. A gun placed with care, not dropped in panic. Blood patterns that suggested bodies moved after death. Lividity, the way blood settles, did not match the positions. Surfaces looked wiped. It was as if someone wanted the story to be simple and pressed on the scene until it became so. Neighbors described Robert as cooperative, polite, and strangely measured. He arrived with prepackaged context. Nancy had been unhappy. He had been trying, and the marriage was difficult. He held eye contact. He did not break. He paused. When asked about the children, his grief sounded clipped, almost procedural. He emphasized his timeline, his whereabouts, the errands that separated him from the moment of death. He was helpful in ways that kept the narrative intact. Forensic tools then were limited. Bloodstain pattern analysis was primitive compared to modern standards. Gunshot residue testing often led to ambiguous results. Without surveillance cameras, without cell phone pings, time was a story you told, and a story others had to accept. The weapon belonged in the house. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle beyond the gunfire itself. Assumptions filled gaps. A mother, a handgun, a stressful life made the theory plausible. And yet, small anomalies persisted. The children appeared to have been shot while still under bedding, an execution carried out with muffling. A pillow used as a suppressor implies planning, not frenzy. The distances suggested someone leaning in close, controlling the muzzle, minimizing noise. If Nancy had killed her children and then herself, the sequence would typically show chaos. Prints smeared in panic. A weapon dropped and grabbed again. Inconsistent staging. What stood out was the absence of chaos. Robert's statements also shifted in minor ways under repetition. He adjusted the time he left, the reason he returned, who he called first. He over-explained certain choices, why a door was locked, why a window was cracked. He was also quick to accept the murder-suicide theory, even to endorse it, which investigators at the time read as a man trying to make sense of the unbearable. In hindsight, endorsing a conclusion before it is reached is a form of control. The case closed on that logic. Nancy, the presumed shooter, took her children and herself. Robert planned funerals, received casseroles, shook hands at services where eulogies tried to separate the mother people knew from the act on paper. He presented as the survivor, a man carrying a grief no one would want. Insurance paid. The house went quiet. Friends repeated the official line because it was the only line available. What nobody knew at the time was how carefully the scene had been curated. Wiped surfaces erased the touch that mattered, but they could not rewrite physics. Trajectory, recoil, post-mortem blood flow. Those signatures waited in boxes, in photos, in reports that would one day be read by different eyes. At the time, though, the investigation ended where it started, with a plausible story and a man ready to move forward. In the aftermath, Robert kept his routines. Work resumed. Social circles rallied, then thinned, as they always do after a funeral. He stayed in the role that soothed suspicion. Composed, attentive, forward-looking. The decision would haunt them because it was not just a closed file, it was a template, a method, and with his slate cleared, he was free to write the next chapter quickly, with a new wife and the same need to control the narrative. Shirley Ann Benedict met him when his grief still carried social currency. He was attentive, present, practiced at reading what people needed to hear. For a woman who wanted steadiness, he looked like a safe harbor, older, composed, already tested by tragedy. Friends would later say, the romance moved quickly, the way relationships do when a narrative is ready-made. He had survived the unthinkable. Surely he knew the value of loyalty. But here is the twist. Control does not vanish after a funeral. It adapts. In the early months, he flooded the space with flowers, gestures, promises of a future uncluttered by the past. Then the temperature changed. He kept late hours, explained them with the same calm tone that had won sympathy. He withheld affection when she pushed on inconsistencies. He played the victim, then the magnanimous partner, toggling roles to keep her off balance. The psychology of the moment is important. His identity depended on managing how others saw him. Shirley was not Nancy. She started documenting things, receipts, missed nights, quick lies. She confided to a small circle that she was considering divorce. By late 1979, she began to gather paperwork, spoke to an attorney, and made a quiet plan to leave. Money sat at the center. Divorce would sever assets, expose affairs, and puncture the carefully protected image he performed for neighbors and colleagues. To him, it was not just separation. It was erasure of control. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, but the outline is unsettling. One day, Shirley was found unresponsive, a collapse framed as personal despair. Death was ruled an overdose. At the time, toxicology testing had limits. Screening panels were narrower, thresholds blunt, interactions poorly mapped. If a person had a prescription, access looked legitimate. If the home was tidy, with no obvious violence, homicide was not the default lens. Investigators noted medications, noted stress, noted the timing. What they did not have were preserved scene details that would later matter. Exact pill counts logged, precise chain of custody for bottles, a robust inventory of substances present, a thorough reconstruction of the hours before she died. There was no reason, in that moment, to suspect a staged poisoning. The result fit the era's template. A woman in a difficult marriage, overwhelmed, a tragedy that looked like an internal failure rather than an external act. From his perspective, the script repeated. He appeared composed, helpful, ready with context. He talked about her mood, her fears about the future, the uncertainty of divorce. He did not rage, he reasoned. He used passive phrasing. Things got difficult. She had been struggling. They were working on it. Language that removed agency from himself while attaching fragility to her. He accepted condolences with the practiced grace of someone who had done it before. In hindsight, patterns are loud. Shirley's death eliminated a financial and reputational threat. It arrived at the edge of separation, where his control faced a formal challenge. It carried the signature of his preferred theatre, an intimate space, a tidy scene, a conclusion that absolved him publicly. But there were no charges, no reopening, no forensic counterweight strong enough to resist the narrative at the time. She was mourned, then folded into the same community story. Another woman gone, another calamity orbiting the same man. And then there was the quiet exit. He moved on. Work, dates, the constant curation of normalcy. Grief gave him cover. Charm gave him access. 2 households ended with him at the center, yet he kept slipping through the gaps created by assumption and limited science. That is how pattern blindness works. Each death explains the last, until the ledger gets too heavy to ignore. Years would pass before anyone weighed it properly. Greta loved wide views. Friends said she liked the quiet that came with big skies, the way distance settled the mind. The Grand Canyon trip, spring of 1993, looked like reconciliation on paper, time together after strains, a chance to reset. He framed it as romance, a bucket list hike, just the 2 of them on the south rim where sunlight turns rock into a slow fire. Photos show them smiling, his arm light across her shoulder, a tourist ease that hides intent, if intent is there. The psychology of the moment is important. He chose the itinerary, the lodging, the route. He suggested early walks before crowds thickened, before rangers set up at popular lookouts. He rerouted them away from fenced areas towards spur paths with looser boundaries, places where footing is reliable until it is not. Greta trusted him. She had reasons to. He sounded like a man who wanted to fix things, and he kept his voice low, even when they disagreed. Witness accounts differ in small ways, as they always do. A couple from Ohio remembered a man and woman arguing lightly near Moran Point. Nothing heated, more like negotiations over pace. A family corralling kids heard laughter, then saw only the man a few minutes later, standing alone at a vantage, scanning downward. What stands out in multiple versions is the delay. The call for help did not come instantly. He looked, then waited, then flagged someone, then sought a ranger. Forensic landscape here is not like a living room. It is geology and gravity. Investigators study rock striations, vegetation scars, the path a body takes when it falls. Greta's injuries mapped a clean drop off a slanted lip, a slide to a lower ledge, an impact that left little margin for survival. There were no defensive scrapes on his hands, no torn clothing suggesting a desperate grab gone wrong. His story, that she stepped close for a photo and lost balance, fit an accident template that national parks see too often. But here is the twist. The details around the moment drifted when pressed. He described the angle differently in separate interviews. Sometimes he said, He warned her back. Sometimes, he said, she insisted on a better view. He struggled to fix the exact spot when rangers asked him to point it out later. He spoke in passive phrases. There was a slip. She was gone. Language that removes the actor. Life insurance mattered. Paperwork showed a recent policy adjustment, modest but tidy, paired with will changes that placed him in the efficient center of her estate. The trip's timing lined up with those administrative moves. He was not careless about it. He was deliberate. Rooms booked in his name, routes printed, sunrise and sunset notes made in his pocket planner. He performed normal planning to hide abnormal intent, if intent existed. In hindsight, that is a hallmark. The theatre of care used as cover. The Park Service investigation treated it as an accident. They took statements, photographed the ledge, logged weather and visibility, and documented the body recovery. Rangers are trained to recognize staging when it is obvious, but the canyon offers plausible deniability. A misstep is a heartbeat. A life ends in silence, broken only by wind. Without a witness to the push, the paperwork moves toward closure. And yet, in their notes, a ranger wrote 2 words beside his demeanor: unusually calm. Micro-stories matter. A tourist recalled him asking about the best trail for sunset shots 5 minutes after a ranger told him recovery would take hours. Another said he offered a small smile when a camera shutter misfired nearby, as if old reflexes, be pleasant, be helpful, overrode the scene. Not guilt, necessarily, but an odd normalcy, where urgency should have been. Meanwhile, back in Colorado, he positioned himself as the surviving partner once again. He called friends, framed the death as a freak accident, a moment of awe turned catastrophic. He accepted condolences with the same measured cadence he had used after Nancy and after Shirley. He listened, nodded, avoided embellishment. He knew the value of underplaying. Grief, done in a low register, invites fewer questions. What nobody knew at the time was that an old case was breathing again. A detective in Colorado had started revisiting the 1978 files, finding edges that did not quite smooth out. When that detective learned of a canyon fall tied to the same man, the ledger shifted. Accidents are not impossible, but patterns matter. A spouse dead by gun in the home. Another dead from an overdose. A third gone off a cliff. Geography changed. The outcome did not. Behavioral cues sharpened under that lens. His travel choices looked less like spontaneity and more like staging. He selected places where physics would do the work, where the environment would argue for him. He kept his body free of marks. He managed the first narrative others would hear. He let systems do what they often do. Assume, file, move on. The canyon, in the end, gave him exactly what he wanted: ambiguity. It reduced the act, if there was an act, to a moment that resists proof. But ambiguity does not erase intention. It just hides it in the wind. Years later, when investigators came back with better questions, the rim walk took on a different logic. It read like a script he had used before: find a private edge, smile for the camera, and create a fall that looks like fate. 3 states away from the canyon, a cold case detective in Colorado took an old banker's box off a shelf. Inside were photographs that never sat right, a diagram of a bedroom that contradicted its own logic, and a death certificate that solved too much, too quickly. Why did the gun rest so neatly by Nancy's hand? Why did the blood pooling disagree with the body's final posture? The detective started cataloguing anomalies, not to prove a theory, but to test the original assumptions that ended the 1978 investigation. What stands out now in retrospect is that the file was not only thin, it was shaped. Statements foregrounded Nancy's supposed depression. Yet her medical records showed no formal diagnosis, no prescriptions that pointed toward a mental health break. Friends described a stressed marriage, yes, but also a mother reliably engaged with her kids' routines. When the detective cross-checked the funeral guest book with interview lists, a pattern emerged. Many people closest to Nancy were never formally interviewed, only paraphrased through Robert's summaries. Meanwhile, the ballistics diagram bothered him. The entry angle on Nancy's head wound suggested a shot delivered from a position that did not match her seated posture, unless she twisted her wrist in an unlikely way. And the pillow. Lab notes from the time mentioned loose fibers, singeing on fabric. It implied the use of a suppressor, which in domestic scenes almost always means premeditation. The detective made a list titled Staging Indicators, wrote each anomaly under it, and flagged the case for review. While that was happening in Colorado, the Grand Canyon report crossed his desk via a routine database sweep. Same man, different household, another tragic death. Accidents happen in national parks, often, but juxtaposed with a prior family annihilation written as murder-suicide, the canyon fall became a question, not a conclusion. He called the National Park Service and asked for their file. He wanted photographs, weather logs, and any verbatim phrasing from the husband's statements. What nobody knew at the time, sitting in separate jurisdictions, was that the same calm cadence threaded through all three deaths. The detective played Robert's interviews from 1978, then read transcripts from the canyon. The linguistic rhythm matched, passive constructions, minimal self-reference during the critical moments, carefully inserted context about the victim's mood. She was troubled. There was a slip. Things had been difficult. It was not proof. It was pattern. Interviews reopened. Friends who had stored discomfort for years began to speak. One colleague remembered Robert practicing lines before delivering them to police, as if he were rehearsing a radio script. A neighbor recalled seeing him carry laundry late at night, the day before the 1978 deaths, even though it was snowing, and he usually used the dryer. Small details, but when investigators create a timeline, irregular habits become markers. They also tracked an offhand confession rumor, third hand, about the canyon. It was not concrete, but it pushed them to sit him down again. Forensic reappraisal became the lever. Old autopsies cannot change, but interpretations can. Bloodstained photographs were digitized and reanalyzed. Lividity patterns supported the idea that Nancy had been repositioned post-mortem. Distance testing suggested the shots to the children were contact or near contact, through bedding, consistent with an execution, inconsistent with a mother shooting in chaotic sequence before turning the gun on herself. The detective documented each technical point in plain language, anticipating defense pushback later. Parallel action unfolded in Arizona. Park Service investigators, alerted by Colorado, revisited the rim site. They mapped possible push points, looked at fall trajectories, and compared his claimed vantage with line-of-sight realities. Could a person slip where he said she slipped? Yes. Could someone engineer a stumble with a well-timed nudge and plausible cover? Also, yes. They noted his delayed help call as a red flag, not conclusive, but significant in a pattern analysis. Leverage strategy mattered. Investigators studied Robert's psychology. He liked being the smartest person in the room, enjoyed the performance of reason under pressure, so they offered him an audience. They framed the re-examination as an opportunity to correct the record, to honor the truth, to show he had been misunderstood. They knew that a man who curated his image for decades might talk to preserve it, even when silence would protect him more. And then something shifted. In a recorded session, he conceded a hypothetical. If Nancy had not shot the children, what then? He did not deny as directly as before. He redirected. The detective pressed. He walked him through each anomaly, not confrontationally, but methodically. The canyon came next. Why the delay? Why the inconsistent spot? Why the insurance changes? The room went quiet. Then he started narrating around the edges, not admitting, but circling. The net was tightening, and he could feel it. Pressure built beyond interviews. Prosecutors signaled willingness to file charges if a confession aligned with the reinterpreted evidence. Family members were invited to observe portions of the process, a visible reminder of the human cost. The detective's final move was simple. He laid out photographs from 1978 beside a landscape shot of the rim, two scenes separated by years but linked by method. This was the moment everything changed. Faced with the architecture of his own patterns, Robert began to talk. He did not start with, "I did it." He started with qualifiers. "If you look at it a certain way," he said, "you could say mistakes were made." The detective let the silence widen. Control was his first reflex, so he tried to shape the room with language, to set terms before terms were set for him. The psychology of the moment is important. For decades he had curated an identity, competent, resilient, unlucky. If he confessed, that architecture collapsed. But he also saw an opportunity to author the collapse, to decide what it would look like. He leaned forward, fingers interlaced, and spoke in a tone that sounded like a radio host correcting a rumor. "Things were complicated in 1978, he began. There was a lot of pressure. He narrated around pronouns. The gun went off. Not, I pulled the trigger. The pillow was there. Not, I used the pillow. Distancing language kept him 1 degree away from the act. Investigators noted it and stayed patient. They walked him through the children's rooms, bedspreads, contact shots. He stopped redirecting. They were asleep, he said, so there was not any noise. He exhaled, then added, "It needed to be quick." This was the moment everything changed. He moved from hypothesis to ownership, but even ownership was framed as judgment, not impulse. Nancy was not going to make it easy, he said. She had plans. He described a morning rehearsal in his head, where he would clean, organize, leave, and return at the right hour. He said he placed the handgun by her hand because people expect the story to look a certain way. He called it the arrangement, a chilling euphemism for staging. Why now? Investigators had promised no death penalty if he cooperated fully. Age and illness were pressing in. He understood that time was a currency he could not control. He wanted to secure the one commodity he had always prized, narrative. "I was not angry," he insisted. "I was practical." He said it as if practicality were exculpatory. He described wiping surfaces because mess confuses people, and he did not want confusion. He wanted acceptance. They asked about the children directly. He stared at the table. They would not understand the divorce, he said. Then he corrected himself, not into empathy, but into optics. They would have questions. He never used their names in that portion. He used categories. The kids. The situation. Linguists call it lexical erasure. It softens the reality of killing by stripping individuality from victims. The detective repeated their names anyway, placing them back into the room. He detailed the scene construction. Pillow over muzzle, 1 shot apiece, bedding drawn up afterward to maintain the illusion of sleep. Nancy last, in the bedroom, a single headshot, gun reset near her dominant hand. He explained the angle problem by demonstrating how he helped the posture after death. He said, "helped," 3 times. Each time, the detective mirrored back the plain phrase, "You moved her." When the canyon came up, he took longer. He veered into weather, tourists, the glare. The detective brought him back to the ledge. "You waited," he said. "Why?" He pressed on timing. Robert said, "People panic," as if he were describing a species, not himself. Then he offered the pivot he had been building toward. "She liked the view," he said. "She wanted a closer look." I guided her hand. He paused. And then there was a step. "Did you push her?" the detective asked. He did not say yes. He measured a narrow path between denial and admission. "I created the opportunity," he said. "I took it." He described a slight nudge at the small of her back, a distraction, pointing at a striation, so her weight shifted forward. He said he had chosen that section because people slipped there, because the edge ran clean, because the fall would read like a misstep. He kept his hands unmarked by holding her elbow lightly, then releasing. Throughout, he framed motive as mercy, as if his actions were a grim favor. "They were unhappy," he said of Nancy and Greta, "and I ended it." Investigators heard predation, not mercy, control disguised as caretaking. He emphasized finances only when asked, minimizing the insurance adjustments as responsible planning. He admitted the will changes, then wrapped them in adult language. Estate housekeeping. It is a pattern in domestic homicides. Offenders couch self-interest in the vocabulary of duty. They asked about Shirley. The air shifted again. He smiled a little, a tell, when he felt in command. "That was complicated," he said. He referred to prescriptions, to stress, to her sensitivity to certain medications. He did not confess, not cleanly. He let implication do the labor, discussions of doses, access, timing near divorce. "You could imagine," he offered, "how someone might miscalculate." It was the same passive hedge, laying down a guided path without stepping on it. What stands out now in retrospect is that even while confessing, he curated. He wanted to be seen as a strategist, not a brute, as a rationalist, not a sadist. He highlighted planning, minimized emotion, claimed efficiency, and tried to rearrange the moral weight, not rage, but order, not chaos, but logic. The detective did not argue philosophy. He anchored him to verbs. You shot, you moved, you pushed. When the interview ended, the room felt thinner, the way it does when a hidden shape finally stands up in plain sight. He had given them what they needed to file charges: method, sequence, intent. He had also given himself what he craved, for the last time: authorship. He shaped the confessional script, but the facts outran him. Families were notified, prosecutors prepared, and the story he had stage-managed for decades turned into a record he could not control. They brought him back to 1979, not to relive grief, but to test the edges of a story that never hardened into fact. Shirley Ann Benedict, the second wife, died in a quiet room with medication bottles aligned on a nightstand. The certificate called it an overdose. No struggle, no forced entry, no obvious violence. But after his confession about Nancy and the canyon, that tidy conclusion demanded a harder look. The stakes were obvious. If Shirley was poisoned, then the pattern was not just diversity of method, it was escalation of control. Firearm staging to cliff accident to chemistry, each chosen because it reduced noise and maximized plausible deniability. Investigators treated the case as a thought experiment anchored to documents that still existed. They obtained pharmacy records, insurance filings, and any medical notes tied to her prescriptions. They mapped who had access, who handled refills, who knew her dosage and schedule. Constraints defined the effort. Biological samples had degraded. Tissue preserved for routine purposes offered little. Toxicology from that era was a blunt instrument. Screening panels missed compounds outside narrow lists, and even when a drug showed up, concentration windows were wide and context-dependent. Scene preservation was minimal, no meticulous pill counts, no photographs of bottle caps for trace prints, no chain of custody on a glass of water that might have held residue. They were not building a lab case, they were building a probability. Shirley's friends described a woman stabilizing around a decision to leave. Anxiety? Yes. Hopelessness? No. She was meeting an attorney, assembling documents, and setting aside cash. A friend recounted that she began locking her purse, a small act of self-protection. She also told two people she believed he was tracking her movements. The psychology of the moment is important. When control is threatened, proximity becomes the offender's advantage. Medication lives inside that proximity. Investigators reconstructed the final week. A refill appeared early, picked up by Robert as a favor. He accompanied her to a doctor's appointment that he insisted was casual. He prepared meals, something he rarely did, citing kindness. He offered tea at night. The timing aligned with a divorce step she had scheduled, an appointment to sign initial filings. She died before it occurred. When laid beside his confessed methods, those gestures lost their benevolent shape. They asked him again. He kept to the same posture. Soft voice, passive grammar. She was on a lot of things, he said. Sometimes the combinations can be unforgiving. He referenced side effects, tolerance, and the unpredictability of stress. Then he slid in implication. If someone were careless with timing, it could be dangerous. He did not claim carelessness. He built a path where dosage becomes lethal without visible violence. Control through ambiguity. A probable scenario emerged. Gradual dosing, not a single spike. Administered through routine. Tea, soup, nighttime capsules. Enough to create sedation, then respiratory depression, especially if mixed with alcohol or another sedative. No drama, no mess. A discovery consistent with a self-inflicted narrative, especially in an era that granted that narrative quickly when marriages cracked and women were framed as fragile. The red flags stacked: a divorce imminent, financial exposure for him, access to her medications, an early refill, and a death scene that neutered suspicion. Insurance was present, modest but timely. His grieving performance matched the cadence investigators now recognized, controlled, informative, guiding listeners toward an internal cause. It was the same choreography he had practiced for years. Could they prove it? No. The record's holes were permanent. They could not exhume certainty from paperwork and degraded tissue. But patterns do not vanish because a test fails. They become the context in which remaining facts live. Prosecutors kept Shirley in the narrative, not as a charge, but as a contour of his behavior, a warning etched into the timeline. In the end, the official line stayed murky. The file carried an asterisk, without a legal remedy. Yet for families, for investigators, the weight of evidence, behavioral, circumstantial, psychological, leaned one way. He had admitted to planning, to staging, to taking a life at a canyon's edge. Shirley's death fit that architecture too neatly to ignore. With that unresolved silence acknowledged, attention turned to consequences. Once the confession was on record, the posture shifted from pursuit to containment. Prosecutors understood the evidentiary terrain: thin physical corroboration in 1978, geology masking intent in 1993, and a non-admission hovering over 1979. They built a strategy around what he had given them: method, sequence, and motive, in his own words. The priority was not spectacle, it was certainty. Death penalty talk evaporated by design. They had promised him an escape from it to secure truth, and they kept that promise. In return, they demanded formal pleas on the 1978 murders and the 1993 Canyon homicide, plus a complete, recorded proffer detailing staging and planning. No courtroom theatrics, no cross-examination arena for him to perform in. He had always preferred controlled environments. The state now controlled the terms. Defense counsel leaned on age and health. He was older, dealing with illness, and unlikely to survive an extended trial. They floated mitigation. No prior violent convictions on paper, public service, steady employment, framing him as an outlier rather than a pattern. But mitigation does not erase a record he authored. The confession stripped the varnish from decades of self-presentation. In hearings, the language turned clinical. Counts were read, dates anchored, victims named. When asked to confirm, he spoke softly, conceding the essentials while still trying to hold on to euphemism. The judge cut through it. Plain words replaced his vagueness. You shot Nancy. You killed your children. You pushed Greta. Each sentence was its own erasure of ambiguity. He answered yes. Sentencing became a ledger. For the 1978 murders, life terms reflected the magnitude of killing a spouse and 2 children in their sleep, the calculated staging, the community deception. For the Canyon homicide, another life term, consecutive, acknowledged a separate plan carried out years later, mirroring the same cold calculus. There was no parole reality. Health considerations changed placement and care, not the horizon. The rest of his life would unfold inside a controlled perimeter. Families spoke, not to dramatize, but to mark absence. A brother described decades of not knowing, how holidays felt like a performance around an empty chair. A friend of Nancy's said she had kept the last grocery list, Nancy wrote, a normal artifact turned memorial. One relative of Greta's recounted the phone call from the canyon and the clock that never restarted afterward. Relief threaded through grief. Relief at finally being allowed to say murder without being corrected by paperwork. The psychology of the endgame is important. In custody, he reverted to ritual. He wrote letters, sounding measured, still explaining. He took jobs that allowed quiet control, library carts, orderly stacks, the tiny geographies where rules are neat and outcomes predictable. He remained polite with staff, avoided fights, kept his affect even. The same choreography that once kept neighbors comfortable now kept cell blocks calm. There were no grand interviews from prison. He had already told the story the way he wanted, and the courts had fixed the legal version. He stayed away from documentary crews, wary that new questions would pry past his chosen framing. He held to a final script: practical decisions made under pressure, not cruelty. But isolation has its own mirror. Without an audience, the performance collapses into routine. His death in custody arrived without spectacle. Declining health, a medical transport, a quiet passing, recorded in a line of prison logs. No cliff, no staged bedroom. A quiet exit compared to the lives he erased. For the record, the cases were closed. For the people who lived with the aftermath, closure was not a date. It was the end of being told their intuition was wrong. What stands out now in hindsight is not just the violence, but the long silence that followed each act. Systems believed the first plausible story, then moved on. It took a detective's persistence, a willingness to reopen pain, and a strategy that prized certainty over drama to finally name what happened. In the end, the courtroom did not restore what was lost. It did something narrower, but vital. It put the truth on paper, where his control could not reach. Bias made tidy stories irresistible. Mothers break, hikers slip, survivors endure, forensics matured. Bloodstain dynamics, lividity mapping, victimology, linguistic analysis. Patterns connected across jurisdictions. Staging, insurance timing, control. Prevention means linking files, flagging coercive control, and treating unlucky survivors as data points. Cold cases are not nostalgic. They are corrective. Let's get to the second story. Two gunshots cracked the pre-dawn quiet in La Jolla. A phone cord hung torn from the wall, the bedsheets already turning dark. Linda gasped once. Dan reached for the receiver he'd used 1,000 times, but tonight it wasn't there. In the doorway, a figure exhaled, steady, controlled. "Okay," she whispered. "You got your revenge." Was this impulsive or measured? A panic or a plan? Restraining orders, copied keys, a .38 revolver. To understand a whisper like that, we need to go back, before the erasure, before the rage hardened into something no one in that house could undo. At the start, it looked like an arc you could diagram in a magazine spread. Two ambitious kids from Catholic families, a wedding in 1969, the feeling that sacrifice now would buy comfort later. The psychology of the moment is important. Betty saw marriage as a contract built on endurance. Dan saw it as a ladder, each rung a credential. They moved with purpose. Notre Dame for Dan, then Cornell for medical school, then Harvard for law. Yes, medicine to law, a pivot that sounded unusual and unsettling for a young family already counting coupons. Why the switch? Better prospects, bigger stage, the belief that one more degree would finally unlock our turn. Meanwhile, Betty worked, not in a footnote way, but as the engine. 2, then 3 jobs. Babies came quickly, 4 pregnancies in short succession. She sold Tupperware, babysat, balanced ledgers for small offices, rent, formula, used furniture, paid in cash and promises. In their apartments, the wallpaper peeled, the towels did not match, and the second-hand crib creaked. But the story they told each other at night was consistent. This is temporary. What stands out now in retrospect is that money management became a form of control. Dan handled the accounts. He was the one with institutional language, tuition bills, loan papers, reimbursement claims. Betty stretched every grocery dollar and covered the heat bill with a check that might clear if the timing lined up. At the time, it felt like teamwork. In hindsight, the power imbalance was already there. Quiet, growing. Micro-stories tell the truth better than slogans. One winter, the baby's onesies were line-dried in a bathroom with a box fan because the laundromat cost quarters they did not have. One night, Dan came home late from the library, kissed a sleeping toddler, told Betty, "I promise, it will be our turn soon." She nodded, counted out a small cash pile from a coffee tin, and decided which bill could wait. These are not crimes, but they are pressures that shape people. The degree stack paid off in the way degrees often do, slowly, then suddenly. San Diego called. A law firm with clients that sent Christmas baskets instead of cards. The move to La Jolla was not an accident. It was calculated. Dan chose a zip code like he chose classes, strategically. They bought a house across Prospect Street, a view with market value and social meaning. Dinners shifted from spaghetti to catered charity events. Betty traded coupons for calendars, school pickups, volunteer committees, fittings for dresses she would keep wearing because the pictures mattered. At first, it looked like balance. His career rocketed, her calendar filled. The children settled into a rhythm of piano lessons and orthodontist appointments. But in a house where one person's work has a paycheck and the other's does not, gratitude can curdle into entitlement. Dan's workdays stretched, Betty's never ended. He came home with war stories from depositions. She greeted him with kids, laundry, and a mild request for time. He would say, "Not tonight. I am wiped." She would say, "Me too." But there is no off switch here. The early control patterns hardened. He knew the partners, she knew the pediatrician's office hours. He signed retainers, she signed permission slips. The division was not abusive on its face, but it was asymmetrical in leverage. What nobody knew at the time, or maybe they knew and ignored, is that effort without recognition becomes resentment. Then came the signals that seemed small until they were not. Missed anniversaries, a new secretary in his orbit, Linda, who was younger, energetic, and positioned within arm's reach of his calendar and ego. For now, there was no proof, just a shift in temperature, a voicemail that felt too familiar, a birthday that passed with flowers delivered late, a card signed with a lawyer's pen. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Betty's identity was ossifying around the home. The children were her testimony, the house, her report card. When praise arrived, it was about a dinner party, not her endurance. When frustration surfaced, it was termed emotional. The label matters. Once a person gets categorized as emotional, their complaints start to sound like noise. And yet, for all this, they still had moments that made sense. Family photos, beach days, small jokes about their early poverty. These scenes are crucial because they explain why she stayed invested as the imbalance grew. Love, plus sunk costs, is a powerful adhesive. By the end of the 1970s, the arc looked complete on paper. A high-earning attorney, a stable family, a polished social life. But under that polish, hairline fractures. Money had lifted them. Money had also drawn a borderline. Dan's world expanded outward. Clients, conferences, narratives in which he was the hero. Betty's world intensified inward. Schedules, stains, tasks nobody praised unless they were late. This was the moment everything did not change but began to tilt. The La Jolla lifestyle was chosen, not gifted. With it came proximity to temptation, status, attention, and a young woman at the office who could fill silences without bringing up laundry or school forms. The perfect arc did not shatter yet. It cracked, and once a crack appears, pressure finds it. While that crack widened in private, something visible formed in Dan's office. A new hire arrived, 21, poised, efficient. Her name was Linda. She managed calendars, fielded calls, and learned the rhythms of a man who liked punctuality and praise. The proximity mattered. She was inside his workday, where Betty was not. For Betty, identity and status were tied to the home, the club, the dinners where wives compared school fundraisers. For Dan, reputation existed in depositions and boardrooms. The children's stability sat in the middle, quiet at first, then increasingly aware of closed doors and louder voices. Rumors began in the standard way. Light comments about a boss and his secretary. An extra laugh in the hallway. A birthday voicemail that sounded too affectionate. Betty asked direct questions. Dan offered deflections. He was a litigator. Words were tools. He said the talk was gossip, that Linda was good at her job, that jealousy was unbecoming. Those words landed with force, because in their marriage, he had the language of certainty, and she was already labeled emotional. But here is the twist. The more Dan dismissed, the more Betty escalated. Not because hysteria guided her, but because the stall itself was a tactic. Missed anniversaries felt like evidence. A dress returned from the cleaners with a stain she did not recognize became a story she could not unsee. She called the office. She called again. When calls were not returned, she switched to pranks, then to profanity. The psychology of the moment is important. Chronic invalidation can turn protest into obsession. Dan's professional instincts engaged. He tightened procedure. Calls were routed. Assistants became buffers. Documentation increased. He told colleagues there were domestic issues, that he was managing them. Managing meant control, the accounts, the schedules, the narrative of a wife who was becoming unreasonable. Meanwhile, Linda stayed in orbit, efficient, diplomatic, indispensable. There was a birthday cake incident, small but telling. Betty arranged a surprise at the office, a move meant to reclaim space. It did not land. The smiles were stiff, the candles a prop. Later, Dan framed it as embarrassing, unprofessional. From Betty's perspective, it was a plea. See us, not just your cases. That missed connection hardened both positions. A pattern settled. Betty left messages that grew coarse, then threatening in tone. Dan recorded them. He talked to lawyers about options. He refused to concede any affair, keeping the accusation unprovable and the conversation frozen. What happened next remains shrouded in paper, memos, calendars, notes that show closeness without naming it. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, the erasure was of spousal reality. The marriage was being erased, minute by minute, without a formal declaration. For the children, the atmosphere shifted. A parent in the driveway, a few minutes longer than usual, a slammed door, a school lunch forgotten because a morning argument consumed the clock. No bruises, no police reports, but a house vibrating with accusation. Friends noticed Betty's agitation. Some tried to soothe. Some avoided the topic. In these social circles, you do not call it a crisis. You call it a difficult time. Legal leverage moved to the forefront. Dan understood filings, temporary orders, the advantage of controlling the calendar. Betty did not have her own counsel early, not in a meaningful way, because the family lawyer was effectively the husband's network. He managed assets, issued allowances, and set terms. She raged into the phone. He created a record of her rage. Meanwhile, something else was happening to Betty's sense of self. Without work outside the home, Her value lived in the relationship that was now being minimized. Each denial from Dan was not neutral. It was destabilizing. The more she demanded clarity, the more he withheld. The more he withheld, the more she performed her pain in ways that looked dangerous on paper and desperate in private. There were micro details that carried weight. A calendar entry for a late meeting that matched a florist receipt the next day. A missed family dinner aligned with a client reception where Linda was on the guest list. None of this was the confession Betty demanded, but each fact whispered implication. She heard the whisper as a scream. Eventually, the admission arrived, stripped of apology, given on Dan's terms. Linda mattered to him, not office rumor, but reality. Betty's fear of replacement hardened into certainty. The stall had done its work. It bought time for Dan's life to pivot, even as Betty's narrowed. And once the pivot was official, the financial war could begin in earnest. The part where you do not just lose affection, you lose access. Betty responded with more calls, more intrusions, words that sounded like threats to a judge and like pleas to a woman being erased. Dan, now positioned as the rational actor, prepared the next move. The affair was no longer a rumor. It was a step toward a house across town, a new bed, a different future. The door, already closing, clicked shut. The filing hit like a verdict. Dan moved first, with precision, divorce papers, motions for exclusive occupancy, temporary orders that read clean on the page and felt suffocating in the house. The stakes were concrete: the home, the children's routines, and Betty's sense that her life had been converted into an exhibit binder. For Dan, reputation was at risk. A partner in La Jolla does not invite scandal, he contains it. Action followed in tidy steps. A judge signed an order. Dan would remain in the home. Betty would vacate. Police stood by while she collected clothes and a few personal items, the rest catalogued in a way that looked reasonable from a distance and cruel up close. Bank accounts shifted. A support check arrived, the amount calculated by formula, then eroded by the legal fees being drawn from the same financial ecosystem Dan controlled. The checks cleared. The arrears were contested. On paper, she was supported. In practice, she was cornered. Pickups became supervised exchanges, stiff and observed, designed to keep the peace and document the conflict. Holidays fragmented. One Christmas, the tree went up in 2 houses, each child deciding which morning felt less like betrayal. In the calendar, you could see the family cut into neat segments, alternating weekends, rotating birthdays, a summer week split down the middle. It was order, but it was not peace. The silent house changed her. She moved into spaces that did not hold memories, the kind of rentals where the carpet smells faintly of detergent and old meals. The walls a standardized beige. She called. Calls were not returned. She left messages. The machine recorded them, while Dan's counsel archived them. The psychology of the moment is important. When your voice is reduced to evidence, you raise it, which makes the evidence worse. Meanwhile, Dan's strategy tightened. Locks changed. Security installed. Mail rerouted. He focused on procedure, because procedure was his native language. The narrative he built for colleagues and courts was consistent. He provided. She harassed. When she drove by the house at night, headlights off, it looked like stalking. When she parked outside just to watch silhouettes move through rooms that used to be hers, it read as menace. To her, it was mourning. To him, it was Exhibit A. Financial details mattered. The support check, let us say it landed on the 1st of the month, was credited against fees from hearings Dan initiated, reducing the net to something that could not cover both rent and groceries. When she protested, the response was procedural. File a motion, get on calendar, wait. He knew waiting favored the party with stability. She was hemorrhaging time and dignity. There were police escorts, which left marks you cannot wash off. A neighbor sees a squad car and does not ask for context. The rumor travels faster than the facts. Betty's social circle narrowed. Invitations became cautious, then rare. People who once admired her efficiency started using the word volatile. Words can be a form of exile. For the children, the house itself became a message. Their rooms at Dan's stayed neat, curated, as if staged for a listing photo. At Betty's, the atmosphere was raw. She cried sometimes. She raged sometimes. She told stories that made sense to her and sounded chaotic to teenagers. One child forgot a jacket after a midweek dinner. Returning to get it required a phone call, a schedule shift, a tone that signaled compliance. Small frictions teach big lessons about who holds power. At night, the silence pressed in. The refrigerator hum felt loud. The phone's red light blinked when she called their old number. The machine cut her off at the beep. She started writing notes to herself, dates of calls, copies of checks, a ledger of grievance. In hindsight, it reads like a feedback loop. Every denial fed the next outburst. Every outburst justified the next denial. Unknown to her, across town, a new family life was being assembled. Linda's things appeared in Dan's home, then her name on guest lists, then her hand on a child's shoulder in a candid photo. The engagement announcement made what had been implicit, explicit. Replacement. For Betty, that word was an injury. For Dan, it was progress. What stands out now is how procedural victory can feel like strangulation to the person losing ground. The system aims for order. It often misses erosion, the slow wearing down of a person's sense of self. And while that erosion is no excuse for violence, it explains the desperation that followed. The house stayed silent, but inside, something was gearing up for the next move. Everything sharpened when Dan married Linda. The ceremony was not lavish by Hollywood standards, but in La Jolla, it signaled finality. Betty was not the estranged spouse anymore. She was the former. The roles were set. Across Prospect Street, a new household took shape, curated and careful, where the photos in silver frames did not include her. For the children, loyalties shifted under pressure. Polite respect for their father's new wife, complicated affection for their mother, and the sense that every choice carried a consequence. The stakes were now existential for Betty. Identity, place, and the proof that her years of sacrifice had not been an easily replaced function. For Dan, the stakes were reputational. A fresh marriage needed calm, not sirens. He moved to ensure it. Locks changed again, access codes updated, security tightened. He documented everything, because paper protects the person in control. He wanted quiet. She had a storm she could not turn off. Incidents piled up. There were uninvited entries, property damage claims, and messages that a judge would call harassing. Address slashed, a note left, a voice on tape, hissing humiliation. Dan's attorneys assembled a narrative from recordings and affidavits. The ex-wife was escalating. Restrict her. Restrain her. A court granted orders. Stay away from the house, from the office, from Linda. Service of process landed like a public shaming. Betty's name on legal paper, the words restrained by court order underlined, read like a diagnosis. The orders did not fix the underlying psychology. They narrowed her options, which made the pressure worse. She tried to route around them, calls from payphones, messages through intermediaries, quick appearances that ended with her retreating seconds before police arrived. Each contact gave Dan more leverage. Each hearing recorded terms that confined her life to narrower lanes. She asked judges to see the context, the years of invalidation, the financial squeeze. The replies were procedural, follow the orders. Violations brought contempt charges, and, for a time, brief custody consequences that cut deep. When your children become a sanction, your panic changes shape. Meanwhile, Linda lived inside a paradox. She had won the place in the household and the target on her back. Friends said she wanted peace, that she urged Dan to get help for Betty, or at least more secure boundaries. There are stories, never fully resolved, about Linda calling and telling Betty to get help, a pointed kindness or a provocation, depending on who is recounting it. In that house, an unopened bridal registry collected dust in a closet, a symbol of the life they wanted to celebrate without interruption. Instead, they slept with caution. Dan's strategy remained clinical. He hired security and tightened the perimeter. He monitored calls and prepared for depositions. He told colleagues that everything was under control, a phrase that often precedes a break. He believed in law as a shield. Betty no longer believed anything could protect her from being erased, except force. The psychology of the moment is important. When every soft avenue fails, conversation, pleading, embarrassment, the mind can tilt toward hard solutions. Practical escalation followed a simple, chilling list. She copied keys when she could, mapping entry routes in her head from years in that house. She learnt the rhythms, when they slept, when they stirred. She practiced small, controlled moves, approach, entry, exit, and then she bought a gun. A Smith & Wesson .38 revolver, purchased under the banner of protection. Protection from what? From break-ins? From imagined intruders? From a future where she was no one? The label did not matter. The object did. A revolver does not jam easily. It sits heavy, simple, final. Friends noticed the hardening in her voice. The jokes curdled into monologues about humiliation and theft. She said she was not crazy. She was furious. She said no one listened when she used her words. She said they would listen to something else. Those statements sounded like venting to some, like threats to others. On tape, nuance disappears. A prosecutor hears intent. Dan and Linda adjusted, but their guard could not stay up forever. Life crept back in, dinners with friends, an early night, a late morning. They trusted their alarms, their legal orders, their sense that boundaries would be obeyed. What stands out now is that everyone underestimated the velocity of a closed system. The restraining orders contained the behavior on paper. They pressurized it in reality. In this final stretch, micro-stories mapped the slide. A casual lunch where Linda scanned the door twice. A child's recital where Dan sat 2 rows ahead, stiff, aware of eyes. A quiet drive where Betty rehearsed speeches that never got delivered. She returned to the firing range once, checked her aim, and said nothing about it to anyone. Preparation and impulse are not opposites when someone lives inside a loop. You get ready, and you wait for the moment that feels inevitable. By fall of 1989, the conflict had a metronome, court dates, counseling recommendations, messages recorded, violations alleged. The orders stood, the phone kept ringing. The new marriage tried to normalize the extraordinary. And then, just before dawn on November 5th, after months of planning made from pain, one decision left the realm of words. Everything narrowed to a key, a hallway, and a trigger pulled in a room that had once been a dream. Before sunrise, the neighborhood on Cypress Avenue felt suspended, the ocean air cold, the streetlights still humming. Betty parked a few houses away, shut the door with care, and slipped the stolen key from her pocket. The house had muscle memory for her, even after years. How the latch sat, how the back entry stuck if you did not lift, how stairs creaked if you chose the wrong riser. She moved with the patience of someone who had mapped it all. The psychology of the moment is important. She was not rushing. She was managing breath, counting steps, keeping the revolver steady in her bag, then in her hand. The house's security had a blind spot, human, not technical. They trusted sleep. She crossed the dark kitchen, paused to let her eyes adjust, and climbed. Carpet absorbed the sound. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry and the inside of closets. On the nightstand ahead, a faint digital clock glowed. In the bedroom, Dan and Linda slept. Sheets pulled high, the pattern from their registry visible in the low light. Betty stopped at the foot of the bed. One more breath. The revolver rose. 5 shots followed in a compressed, mechanical sequence. 1 round went wild into the headboard, splintering wood. 2 struck Linda. 1 severed her carotid, a fatal path that turned breath into a gasp and blood into flood. 1 or more rounds hit Dan in the chest, catastrophic but not instantly quieting. He moved, reacting by instinct toward the phone. What happened next matters for intent. He reached toward the nightstand, toward safety, toward procedure. Betty stepped close and ripped the phone cord from the wall. Years of recorded messages had taught her what a phone could do. Silence was force. She stood there a moment, looking at what she had done, and then spoke. "Okay," she whispered. "You got your revenge." Whose revenge? The line is debated. Was she accusing Dan, naming the humiliation she had lived with, or declaring her own act complete? The words hung in air that already felt metallic. Linda tried to speak. Witness statements later described a sound, not a sentence. Dan's last movement was small, a hand sliding, then still. The facts are clinical. Trajectory lines on diagrams, stippling where patterns indicated distance, a bullet lodged in bedding, 2 retrieved from bodies at autopsy. But forensic detail does not capture the room's temperature change, the way quiet becomes absolute. She did not search the house. She did not stage anything. She left, down the stairs, through the kitchen, out into that pre-dawn hour, where joggers had not started yet, and newspaper trucks still owned the streets. She drove to a friend's, according to later accounts, and then turned herself in to police. On the record, she said she was frightened, humiliated, erased. She said the gun went off, that panic guided her, that she had not meant to kill. Prosecutors heard planning in every verb: entry, approach, fire, disable the phone, depart. Meanwhile, neighbors woke to sirens and tape. Officers moved through the house. cataloguing. The torn phone cord was photographed where it lay. The bed was measured. The positions of bodies were noted against the clock on the nightstand, producing a time window that fit the 5:30 a.m. estimate. In the aftermath, the crime scene took on a second life in court, and media, drawings, reenactments, angles, analyzed frame by frame to answer a single question: was this calculated? For the children, the call landed like an impact you cannot brace for. 2 parents gone in 1 hour, 1 dead, 1 under arrest. They had lived for years in the noise of their parents' war. Now, silence arrived as a verdict. A child asked where to go that night. Another asked what to tell friends. These are not legal questions, but they define the harm. In custody, Betty gave statements that cut 2 ways. She described standing in that doorway and feeling a pressure release, not joy, but a shutting off of the humiliations loop. She said she had tried to talk for years and no one listened. Investigators considered the purchase of the revolver, the stolen key, the timing, the practiced approach as evidence of clear-headed intent. She pushed back. She said she was in a state she could not escape. The city's legal elite flinched. Dan had been one of them, a name on firm letterhead, a presence in courtrooms. Journalists did not need a dramatic frame. They had facts that already sounded like a script. The secretary, the divorce, the restraining orders, the gun, the whisper. But here is the twist. The most unsettling part was not novelty. It was familiarity. Everything that happened in that room was prepared by hundreds of smaller choices, most of them lawful, many of them cold. By late morning, evidence techs had finished the first pass. They bagged the torn phone cord, collected casings, traced bullet paths. The medical examiner's team moved the bodies. The bed where 2 people had planned a future became an exhibit. Outside, cameras gathered. Inside, chalk marks and measuring tapes mapped the narrative the jury would eventually read. In a holding cell, Betty waited. Statements were compared against call logs, against a neighbor's report of a car door, against the gun's residue pattern on her hands. When they asked why she pulled the cord, she said phones had been used against her for years. When they asked why 5 shots, she did not have an answer that softened anything. The facts did not bend, the act ended there, but the story did not. The night of the murders gave prosecutors a clean frame and the defense a psychological one. In the morning light, a private war became public record, and the question shifted from what happened to what it meant. Courtrooms do not heal, they sort. By 1990, Betty Broderick walked into a system that valued sequence and motive, while she spoke in loops of humiliation and fear. The charges were clear, 2 counts of murder. The questions were surgical. What did she intend, and when did intention harden into action? The prosecution led with preparation. They built a staircase. The revolver purchase, the stolen key, the pre-dawn entry, the 5 shots, the torn phone cord. Each step suggested forethought. Diagrams showed bullet trajectories. Photos fixed the scene in jurors' minds, the headboard strike, the bedding saturation, the phone lines severed. Their thesis was simple. She planned, she executed, she ensured silence. The defense tried a different lens. Erosion. They did not claim innocence. They argued context. Years of invalidation, legal strangulation, the rapid replacement of a spouse with her social double, all culminating in a dissociative state. They borrowed language from battered woman syndrome, but without the classic markers of physical injury. Instead, they spoke of psychological abrasion, chronic gaslighting, financial control, custodial leverage. Could abuse exist when the bruises were bank statements and court orders? Witnesses gave the case texture. Friends described Betty's slide from witty to raw, from composed to volatile. Former neighbors recalled police escorts and the heavy quiet that followed. Colleagues of Dan, precise in diction, testified to his efforts to maintain order, to protect his new marriage. Those words carried weight because they came dressed in professional certainty. In a courtroom, tone can be evidence, Betty testified. The cadence changed when she took the stand. Longer sentences, looping back, pain braided with indignation. She described the phone calls that went unanswered, the support checks that evaporated into fees, the day she saw Linda wearing a dress she recognized. She said the gun went off in panic, not design. She said the torn cord was reflex, the same reflex that had cut her off on answering machines for years. The jurors watched the person who had left the room on Cypress Avenue and tried to match her words to the facts on the projector. But here is the twist. The first jury could not agree. After weeks of testimony, they returned hung on the major counts, split by a line that mirrored the culture. Was this calculated carnage, or the last act of a woman eroded past reason? The judge declared a mistrial. Outside, microphones multiplied. Inside, counsel recalibrated. For the second trial, the prosecution sharpened edges. They leaned harder on the torn phone cord as an act that lives only in the premeditation column. They highlighted ammunition, a revolver loaded beyond chance, the extra rounds signaling expectation of use. They called the whisper, "You got your revenge," a confession in miniature, not of panic, but of purpose. The narrative tightened. She entered to kill, and killed. The defense narrowed too. They focused on psychological injury that does not leave marks, administrative exile, reputational ruin, the relentless replacement narrative. Experts explained how chronic invalidation can distort cognition, how obsession forms like scar tissue. They did not excuse the act. They framed it as the endpoint of a pressure vessel. Vent early, it releases. Seal it, it ruptures. Media turned the courtroom into a stage. Magazine profiles juxtaposed prom photos with crime scene sketches. Talk shows debated whether words could be weapons, whether a phone cord could be as damning as a confession. The public split along lines of empathy and order. Some saw an abandoned wife crushed by a system optimized for the powerful. Others saw a calculated killer dressing a plan in grievance. The children testified in careful, contained ways. They spoke about two households, about a mother who could be loving and then unmoored, about a father who could be generous and then distant. Their words did not answer the legal question, but they deepened the human one. What does instability do to a mind that is already isolated? Closing arguments drew the border. The prosecutor pointed to the doorway, the aim, the sequence. This was a decision, he said, not a spasm. The defense pointed to the months before the doorway, the years before the decision. This was a collapse, counsel argued, engineered by slow erasure. Both versions contained truth. Only one would carry the verdict. The jury returned with second-degree murder, 2 counts. Not premeditation in the first-degree sense, but intentional lethal acts without the legal hallmarks of deliberation the statute demanded, 32 years to life. In effect, a lifetime measured by parole boards and annual memory. The sentence landed like a seal on a long, public argument. In the hallway, cameras caught the aftermath. No victory laps, no shouted apologies, just the administrative choreography of custody. Reporters asked if she felt remorse. She said she felt unheard. That answer echoed the years before the shots and sat uneasily against the photographs from that room. And yet, for all this, what stands out in hindsight is that the trial was not just about one woman. It was about how courts translate domestic breakdown into elements of a crime, how the law weighs intent when motive is soaked in humiliation, how a community chooses between empathy and deterrence. The narrative war did not end with the gavel. It moved to living rooms and parole hearings, where meaning gets argued over and over, often by people who were not in that house, or that marriage, or that moment when a phone cord snapped and silence took over. In the aftermath, the children learned to live with 2 silences, the one that followed the gunshots, and the institutional quiet of visiting rooms. They were teenagers growing into adults under a story that never left them. Birthdays did not arrive, they were arranged. You called a prison, scheduled a time, and drove to a building where love had to pass through glass. The psychology of the moment is important. Each child carried a different version of their parents, shaped by age on the night of the murders and by the years before. One saw a father who had abandoned a household and a mother who finally snapped. Another saw a father trying to restore order and a mother who turned grievance into violence. These are not contradictions, they are angles. Betty wrote, constantly. Thousands of letters over the years, tight script, a rhythm that combined apology-adjacent regret with a steady insistence that she was forced into a corner. She wrote to friends, to strangers, to authors who had profiled the case. She wrote to her children most of all, updates, memories, small jokes about their childhood, and reiterated explanations for the morning on Cypress Avenue. In those letters, she called the murders a disaster she did not intend, a catastrophe born from humiliation and fear. She rarely called them what the law called them, murders. Media visits turned those letters into a public archive. Interviews in the 1990s and 2000s offered a figure who sounded resolute to some, unrepentant to others. She said parole should be about who you are now, not who you were then. She said her crime lived inside a marriage that had been weaponized against her. Viewers heard either context or deflection, Both readings found supporters. Inside, her prison record reflected a standard arc for high-profile inmates. She took classes, occasionally clashed with rules, and sat through counseling offers that asked for the one word that kept sticking: remorse. Counselors noted insight in places, rigidity in others. Disciplinary notes appeared for small infractions, then faded. The core issue never moved enough for boards: acknowledgement. When you say you were erased, but you do not concede the totality of what you erased, parole is a locked door. For the siblings, the years split them into camps, not of loyalty, but of tolerance. Some pushed for parole letters, arguing that time and age had done their work, that their mother did not pose a risk outside. Others opposed release, citing the absence of full responsibility, the fear that narrative would harden further in freedom, not soften. They were not enemies. They were survivors with different thresholds. Micro-stories carry the weight. A birthday call routed through a prison phone. The delay on the line stretching a simple "I love you" into a reminder of distance. A son visiting, listening, leaving, and driving away in silence because there was nothing to fix and nothing to say that had not been said. A daughter opening a letter that began with a memory of a beach day and ended with an argument about legal terms she wished she could forget. Parole hearings became annual performances of harm and hope. Commissioners asked the ritual questions: what happened? Why did it happen? What would you do if faced with humiliation again? They looked for a shift in language from justification to ownership. Each time, a phrase landed wrong, a suggestion that the gun went off, or that the torn phone cord was reflex, not choice. Each time, denial followed, often framed in the bureaucratic language of insufficient insight. The door remained closed. Outside the walls, the case lived a second life. Television movies reenacted scenes with careful lighting and definitive music, flattening nuance into beats. Books cast her as either a martyr of a biased system or an emblem of uncontrolled rage. The public fascination settled into a familiar pattern. Choose a side. Hold it. Send letters to the parole board. Post opinions that would not change anyone's mind. The story stayed warm because it was domestic, because it looked like a marriage gone wrong rather than a monster in an alley. What stands out in hindsight is how the children carried on while the narrative kept arguing about their parents. They graduated, worked, built families with an extra layer of caution around conflict. Some visited their mother on holidays, some wrote instead, some pulled back when the conversation returned to courtrooms and calendars. They built boundaries out of necessity. In the late 2000s, another parole denial underscored the pattern: no release without substantive remorse. The commissioners cited ongoing minimization, the lack of clear empathy for Dan and Linda as victims distinct from the marriage story. A phrase from the bench crystallized it: healing for others requires ownership from you. Betty nodded, then circled back to the years before the shots. The loop held. In those years, letters kept moving, visits kept coming, and the siblings kept deciding, again and again, how much of their lives to share with a mother who remained the author of their deepest wound and a part of their daily vocabulary of love. What if this was not only about a marriage, but about leverage baked into systems? Money, procedure, and reputation created a map where one person held tools and the other held noise. The psychology of the moment is important. When courts translate pain into filings, whoever speaks paperwork wins. Start with money control. Dan managed assets, defined support through formulas, and offset payments with fees. On paper, it was lawful. In practice, it narrowed choices until desperation felt like oxygen. Procedure amplified it. Exclusive occupancy, restraining orders, custody calendars. Each order preserved peace while abstracting the human effect. The law aims at safety, but it can institutionalize silence. Then reputation. In a small legal community, narrative travels along trusted lines. A partner's account sounds credible. A volatile ex-wife sounds dangerous. Judges and clerks do not live in the marriage, they live in the record. When emotional becomes the adjective, context turns into liability. Help systems missed the slow burn. Friends suggested therapy. Therapy does not cure erasure if access and cost sit behind the same opponent. Law enforcement saw compliance metrics, not a psyche grinding down. Restraining orders are necessary, but like a sealed pressure vessel, they stop leaks while increasing internal force. Vent early, it releases. Seal it, it ruptures. Forensic psychology reads obsession as a loop. Chronic invalidation, sleep disruption, isolation, and ruminative thought create a fixation that rewards itself. Each unanswered call heightened arousal, each boundary tightened the loop. None of this excuses violence. It explains why warnings, clear on tape after the fact, felt like weather inside the person making them. Ethical guardrails matter. Betty chose the gun, the key, the shots, and the cord. Context explains, not absolves. But what stands out now is preventability in increments. Transparent finances, neutral counsel early, structured therapeutic intervention attached to court orders, supervised exchanges that focus on de-escalation, not only documentation. Systems protect best when they measure harm beyond paper, which brings us back to a whisper in a dark room and the meaning people heard in it. Welcome back again. Please, before we start, comment down below where you are and what time it is there right now. Let's get to it. Shannon Gilbert was just 23 years old when she vanished on the morning of May 1st, 2010. A hopeful young woman, originally from Jersey City, New Jersey, Shannon worked as an escort, advertising her services on Craigslist. Despite her line of work, she had ambitions beyond it. She dreamed of becoming a singer and had been saving money to help her pursue that goal. Friends and family noted her determination, though they also admitted Shannon had her struggles. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and occasionally missed taking her prescribed medication. On the night of her disappearance, though, it wasn't her past struggles or aspirations that took center stage. It was the growing fear in her voice as she made what would become one of the most haunting 911 calls in modern crime history. Shannon was last seen in a gated community in Oak Beach, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood on Long Island's South Shore. That evening, she had been accompanied by her driver, Michael Pack, as part of her work arrangement. In this line of work, it was not unusual to have someone drive and wait nearby to ensure a semblance of security. She had arranged to meet a client named Joseph Brewer, a local resident who lived in this suburban enclave. What exactly happened during their interaction remains unclear, but by the early hours of the morning, Shannon was terrified. At 4:51 a.m., she placed a frantic call to 911, claiming someone was after her. The call stretched on for over 20 minutes. In the chilling audio, Shannon's voice wavered between panic and exhaustion. She repeatedly told the dispatcher, "They're going to kill me," though she didn't provide much clarity on who they were. Her fear was palpable, a kind of raw vulnerability that sticks with you when you hear it. The Suffolk County Police Department, who later made the audio available to the public after years of legal battles, initially treated the call as a low-priority matter. But for Shannon, this was the last lifeline she would grab onto before vanishing into the cold morning air. It is said that during the call, she mentioned both Brewer and Pack, though neither man was charged in relation to her disappearance. Their accounts of that night were inconsistent yet strangely untethered to the gravity of what ended up happening. While on the phone, Shannon left Brewer's house abruptly and began knocking on neighboring doors, pleading for help. At one point, she reached the house of Gus Coletti, an older gentleman who answered her frantic knocks. He later recalled that Shannon looked disoriented and scared, refusing to step inside when he opened the door. Instead, she stood on his porch, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Coletti tried to offer assistance, even calling 911 himself after she bolted from his home. Another neighbor, Barbara Brennan, reportedly saw Shannon running across her yard, still in distress. These accounts painted an unsettling picture of a woman desperate to escape something, or someone, unknown. By 5:30 a.m., Shannon was gone. Witnesses claimed to have seen her run into the marshy wetlands near Oak Beach, a tangle of tall grass and uneven terrain difficult to navigate even in daylight. When police finally arrived, her absence was written off as a case of a woman fleeing into the night, the subtext being that her job somehow made her disappearance less urgent. She was dismissed, not as a victim but as someone who had simply wandered off in a highly emotional state. Yet, her family refused to accept this narrative and immediately began pushing for a more thorough investigation. For Mari Gilbert, Shannon's mother, the lack of urgency in those early hours only deepened her resolve to uncover the truth about what happened to her daughter. The Suffolk County Police Department didn't treat the case with the seriousness it would later demand. Their initial theory was that Shannon had become disoriented and drowned in the marsh, possibly due to her mental health condition or substances, though there was little evidence to support this assumption at the time. Few officers took into account her documented fear on the 911 call, or her very clear actions of running and seeking help. This casual dismissal would set the stage for years of frustration amongst Shannon's family, particularly Mari, who grew increasingly vocal about law enforcement's apparent apathy. As Mari publicized her daughter's story, she told reporters and investigators, if this were anyone else's child, they'd be looking by now. Months later, due largely to Mari's persistence, law enforcement launched a more coordinated search for Shannon in December 2010. The effort initially focused on ending her within a tight radius of where she was last seen. During one of these searches, on an unassuming stretch of Gilgo Beach, not far from Oak Beach, investigators stumbled upon the remains of a woman. The chilling part? They weren't Shannon's remains. Instead, during that search on December 11, officers found the skeletal remains of another woman wrapped in burlap. What should have been an isolated, tragic discovery quickly unraveled into something far darker when, over the subsequent days, 3 more sets of remains were discovered in the same area, all within 500 feet of one another. Each belonged to a young woman, all petite, all in their 20s, and all escorts who, like Shannon, advertised their services online. This grouping of victims, later dubbed the Gilgo Four, turned Shannon's disappearance from a quiet local case into the beginnings of one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killer investigations. The Suffolk County Homicide Squad, once reluctant to devote resources, now found themselves at the epicenter of a growing nightmare. Despite the proximity of the remains, missing persons reports for each of the Gilgo Four had previously been dealt with as unrelated cases. It was only their discovery along Ocean Parkway that forced law enforcement to reckon with a deeply unsettling reality. The Long Island serial killer was likely at work, and Shannon Gilbert's disappearance had shone a spotlight on the hidden dangers lurking just beyond the shoreline. Yet, in this newly unearthed horror, Shannon herself remained missing. With public fear mounting, investigators slowly expanded their efforts, combing through rough terrain with dogs and equipment, while combing through victim reports and online advertisements. Still, it wasn't until December 2011, over a year and a half after her disappearance, that skeletal remains later confirmed to be Shannon's were located in Oak Beach, the same area she had vanished. Her body was also recovered in the marsh near her belongings. A cell phone, credit cards, and jeans. All were scattered in a way that raised questions. Forensic analysis of Shannon's remains proved inconclusive regarding a cause of death. Full skeletal remains make certain conclusions harder to draw than soft tissues might. The Suffolk County Medical Examiner ruled her case inconclusive, leaving the door open to various theories. Did she meet an accidental death in the marsh, trapped by thick mud and sharp reeds, as some believed, or had she become an early victim of the Long Island serial killer, only to be brought to her watery grave? While the questions surrounding Shannon persist, her story lit a fuse. The chilling echoes of her 911 call, which captured both her determination to survive and her overwhelming fear, had become tethered to the larger discovery of what lay beneath the sands of Gilgo Beach. Yet for investigators, this was only the beginning. Shannon's disappearance was an entry point to a harrowing larger truth, one that would take years to unravel and even further propel more mysteries into the public eye. As we shift to exploring the grim discoveries at Gilgo Beach in the aftermath of this search, keep one thing in mind. Shannon Gilbert was searching for help that night. Her cries were heard, but not heeded in time, and as her story collided with those whose cries came before her, it became impossible for anyone paying attention to ignore the silence that enveloped Long Island's most vulnerable victims. The search for Shannon Gilbert expanded methodically across the area surrounding Gilgo Beach in December 2010. After months of stagnation, police had finally committed significant resources to locating her. Officers swept through the marshy terrain with cadaver dogs and other specialized equipment, navigating the cold and unforgiving environment. The sand dunes and thick vegetation of the Long Island shoreline created a quiet, desolate backdrop for their efforts. At first, it was an organized search for a single missing person, but what they discovered would transform the investigation entirely, and it wouldn't start with finding Shannon. On the morning of December 11, 2010, a canine officer leading his dog made a chilling discovery along Ocean Parkway, not far from where Shannon was last seen. Lying partially hidden amidst the brush was what appeared to be human remains. The body hadn't been there recently. This was skeletal material, and it had been wrapped carefully in burlap. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Despite initial hopes, it was quickly confirmed that the remains were not Shannon Gilbert's. This was someone else. And within days, searchers realized there was more to uncover. By December 13, police had expanded the search area and unearthed 3 additional sets of remains, each in similar conditions. Identified in early 2011, these 4 victims came to be known as the Gilgo Four: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Amber Costello. Authorities confirmed that each woman had disappeared between 2007 and 2010, years before Shannon's case had even brought them back to the area. Their disappearances, all initially treated as isolated incidents, were now linked through this devastating discovery. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the first of the Gilgo Four to vanish. She had disappeared in July 2007 while in New York City for work. A single mother from Connecticut, Maureen had been struggling to make ends meet. She had advertised on Craigslist like so many others in her line of work, and her desperation to provide for her children left her vulnerable. Her remains were among those found wrapped in burlap, suggesting a calculated and deliberate crime scene disposal. Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009 at the age of 24. Originally from Buffalo, New York, Melissa had moved to the Bronx, hoping for a fresh start. To fund her ambitions, she worked as an escort, also using Craigslist to connect with clients. Melissa's case stood out to investigators because, after her disappearance, her family experienced a horrifying ordeal. Her teenage sister, Amanda, received multiple calls from someone using Melissa's phone. In each call, the man taunted Amanda, asking if she knew where her sister was. His voice was calm and emotionless. The details he provided showed he had likely been involved in Melissa's fate, yet the use of burner phones and the lack of tracing technology at the time left police with no way to track him. Megan Waterman was only 22 when she disappeared in June 2010. A mother to a young daughter, Megan came from Scarborough, Maine. She too relied on Craigslist to advertise her services and had left her home to meet someone in Long Island the night she vanished. Her family had reported her missing and repeatedly informed police of the dangers her job posed. Yet, like the others, Megan's case attracted little attention at the time. Now her remains joined those of 3 other women discovered in the same cluster. Amber Costello, the youngest of the Gilgo Four, was 27 when she went missing in September 2010. A native of North Carolina, Amber had settled in West Babylon, New York, where she lived with roommates. Described as kind-hearted and trusting, she often put her own safety at risk to support those she cared about. Amber, like the others, had advertised her services online. Her roommates later told police that Amber had left their home one evening, saying she was meeting a client. It was the last time she was seen alive. Her body, like the others, was found near Ocean Parkway. Though their stories varied, the Gilgo Four shared haunting similarities. Each of them was petite, standing around 5 feet tall and weighing close to 100 pounds. They were all in their 20s when they disappeared and had been working as escorts, advertising primarily on Craigslist. Wrapping their bodies in burlap suggested a level of care and uniformity, likely meant to avoid immediate detection. Each victim's remains had been placed within 500 feet of one another, a proximity that made it clear this wasn't random. According to Dominic Verone, then Chief of Detectives for Suffolk County, the connections between the women pointed to a deliberate targeting pattern. Whoever was responsible had chosen them carefully, luring them with crafted messages and controlled interactions. The use of burner phones only reinforced this profile. The oceanfront location of their disposal was another grim detail. Gilgo Beach sits along a stretch of barrier islands that separate Long Island from the Atlantic Ocean. It's a scenic but eerily isolated area, where sprawling marshlands meet desolate beaches. The remoteness provided whoever was responsible with a secluded dumping ground. Yet even among all the details, the burlap wrapping stood out. It wasn't entirely common, and for investigators, it suggested a methodical killer, someone who planned his movements and intentionally left little evidence behind. Beyond the physical details, the emotional impact on the community began to grow. The realization that a serial killer might be operating on Long Island sent waves of fear through the area. Families of missing women working in the same profession began to fear the worst. Advocacy groups criticized police for their initial dismissiveness, not just in Shannon Gilbert's case but in others like it. As the news of the Gilgo Four broke, public speculation swirled. People wondered how long had this killer been active? How many more victims could there be? And why had so little attention been given to the disappearances of these women before now? Law enforcement began to face the uncomfortable questions that had been building for years. Many observed that the victims, as escorts, occupied a vulnerable space in society, one often overlooked by police and the public alike. Their reliance on online platforms like Craigslist, where anonymity was easily maintained, added another layer of difficulty to tracking their movements or identifying their last contacts. Still, it was clear there was a predator out there somewhere, someone who had exploited that vulnerability to deadly effect. For years, the disappearances of women like Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, had been treated with little urgency. Now, their deaths forced Suffolk County to confront the magnitude of what had been missed. As news spread, the term Long Island serial killer began to circulate in media coverage. Yet even as police ramped up their efforts, many in the community started wondering if this killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. The scope of the area meant it was easy for someone familiar with the geography to remain unseen. Ocean Parkway itself stretches for miles, lined by tall reeds and patches of forest, making certain parts nearly impossible to search thoroughly. Investigators expanded their efforts, but challenges piled up quickly. The physical environment, coupled with the time that had elapsed since the women's deaths, made the task of gathering evidence incredibly difficult. Despite these obstacles, the discovery of the Gilgo Four was a turning point. What began as a search for a single missing woman had spiraled into a homicide investigation of unprecedented scale for Suffolk County. The realization that the beach could be doubling as a burial ground left an eerie stain on an otherwise quiet area. It wasn't just about these 4 victims. There was growing suspicion, among the community and investigators alike, that more bodies might be waiting to be found. Authorities shifted their focus, trying to piece together the killer's pattern. Who was he? How was he selecting his victims? And perhaps most haunting of all, was he still active? The search of Gilgo Beach had opened a door to a darker world, one filled with unanswered questions that would only grow more complex as time went on. For now, investigators could only press forward, unsure of just how expansive this case would ultimately become. The lives of the Gilgo Four, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, were distinct in many ways. Yet, the circumstances that united their tragic fates were disturbingly similar. All were young women, petite in stature, who had turned to the internet to work as escorts. They sought clients using Craigslist, a platform that promised opportunity, but also exposed them to dangers hidden behind digital anonymity. Living on society's margins, their disappearances were largely overlooked at first, treated as isolated incidents rather than pieces of a larger, coordinated pattern. But the discovery of their remains along Gilgo Beach in December 2010 connected them in ways no one could ignore. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, in many ways, was the beginning of this unsettling story. A native of Norwich, Connecticut, she was the first of the Gilgo Four to go missing. Maureen was 25 at the time and a single mother of 2 children. Despite her challenges, friends and family described her as determined and resourceful. She had begun working as an escort out of financial necessity, hoping to secure a stable life for her young family. On July 9, 2007, Maureen spoke to her sister Missy Cann by phone from New York City. She mentioned she might return home that evening on a late train. That call was the last contact anyone had with her. For her family, the weeks that followed were agonizing. Maureen had always kept in close touch, so her sudden silence signaled something was terribly wrong. But her status as an escort complicated her case. Maureen quickly became another name among missing persons reports without immediate follow-up. 2 years later, in 2009, the story took a horrifying twist with Melissa Barthelemy's disappearance. At the age of 24, Melissa had moved from Buffalo to New York City, where she dreamed of making it as a hairdresser. To support herself, she worked as an escort, relying on Craigslist like Maureen had. Melissa's case gained national attention not for what was found, but for what happened in the days after her family reported her missing. Nearly a week after her disappearance, Melissa's younger sister Amanda began receiving taunting phone calls. These came from Melissa's phone, as if the older sister herself were calling, but it wasn't Melissa's voice on the other end. It was a man, calm and deliberate, telling Amanda he had killed Melissa. The calls continued for weeks, always laced with cruel remarks and horrifying details about her fate. The teenager begged for answers, but the man offered none. Officials traced the calls to Manhattan, but they were short and made from bustling public areas, preventing any attempt to pinpoint the perpetrator. Melissa's murder underscored the chilling approach of whoever was behind these acts. The phone calls weren't just a way to gloat, they were designed to instill fear, turning the family's grief into absolute terror. The killer didn't simply take life. He aimed to dismantle the lives of those left behind. Melissa's case became emblematic of the calculated and taunting behavior that would later define the Long Island serial killer's profile. Megan Waterman disappeared the following year, in 2010, a 22-year-old mother from Scarborough, Maine. Megan was known for her outgoing personality and fierce love for her young daughter, who was just 3 at the time. Megan had recently traveled to Long Island with her boyfriend, who she described as controlling. She had been working as an escort to support herself and her child, often turning to Craigslist to find clients. Megan's last known movements were captured in surveillance footage from a Holiday Inn in Hauptpaug, New York. The video showed her walking out of the hotel alone, wearing casual clothing, her hair loose around her shoulders. It was the last time she was seen alive. Family members reported her missing shortly afterward, but like Maureen and Melissa, the circumstances of her work seemed to affect the urgency of the response. She became another tragic name on a growing list, one that no one had yet connected. The last of the Gilgo Four, Amber Costello, vanished in September 2010. At 27, Amber was the eldest of the group, but carried an air of vulnerability that her family often worried about. Originally from North Carolina, she had moved to Long Island, where she lived in West Babylon with her roommates. Amber had struggled with addiction, but was deeply loved by those who knew her. She had begun working as an escort to support herself and relied heavily on Craigslist to find clients. On the night of September 2, 2010, Amber told her roommate Dave Schaller that she was meeting a client who had offered her a much higher payment than usual, $1,500, significantly above her going rate. The man had specifically mentioned meeting her alone, which in hindsight raised questions about his intentions. Schaller later described the client as looking like an ogre and recalled that he drove a Chevrolet Avalanche, a detail that would eventually prove crucial to the case. Amber left that night and never returned, her bubbly demeanor now only a memory to those she left behind. For all four women, the use of burner phones became a recurring, eerie thread. The killer had contacted each of them through disposable phones, keeping his tracks covered and erasing any direct way to connect their last known interactions to him. Craigslist, which many escorts used due to its wide reach, provided a perfect cloak of anonymity. Officials later learned that the burner phones used to contact the women had often pinged cell towers near Massapequa Park, Long Island. The killer's knowledge of these tools, burner phones, digital platforms, secluded locations hinted at someone who took deliberate steps to stay one step ahead of investigators. The similarities between the victims were impossible to ignore. Their ages and builds, all petite women in their 20s, were likely not coincidences. They came from different backgrounds but shared a vulnerability rooted in their circumstances. Being escorts, they existed in a profession often stigmatized and treated with suspicion. Even as their cases mounted, the lack of urgency in investigating their disappearances reflected the broader societal biases against sex workers. It allowed their killer to continue undetected, perfecting his methods over time. What stood out most was how methodical the killer seemed to be. He wasn't impulsive or sloppy. The burlap used to wrap the victims' bodies, for instance, suggested preparation, a willingness to plan the details of each crime in advance. It also pointed to someone who knew how to blend into his surroundings, acting unseen in an area frequented by locals and visitors. The precise location of the bodies, tightly clustered along a quiet stretch of Gilgo Beach, spoke to repetition and routine. Whoever it was knew that stretch of land intimately, enough to use it as a dumping ground for years without drawing attention. The discovery of the Gilgo Four's remains forced investigators to rethink everything. This wasn't a single crime of opportunity or a volatile act. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had carefully selected these women, targeted their vulnerabilities, and carried out his crimes with chilling precision. The burlap sacks, the burner phones, the taunting calls, all of it pointed to a killer confident in his ability to evade capture. But as the families of the victims mourned, investigators hit a wall. Despite the pattern emerging, there was little physical evidence to connect anyone to the crimes. The killer's trail was cold, concealed by years of anonymity and forethought. Even as the community grew more fearful, law enforcement struggled to make progress. Leads dried up, and unanswered questions lingered. Was the killer still out there? And if so, when would he strike again? For now, all detectives could do was piece together the fragments, hoping something new would surface to break the deadlock. Following the discovery of the Gilgo Four in December 2010, the investigation faced immediate challenges that set the stage for nearly a decade of frustrating stagnation. Law enforcement now had evidence of at least one serial killer operating in the area, but connecting these cases was far more difficult than it seemed. Each of the four women had gone missing on separate dates, and the years of separation between their disappearances created an obstacle for finding a cohesive thread. Additionally, the women had been reported missing from different states, including Connecticut, New York, and Maine, so their cases were investigated in separate jurisdictions. The Suffolk County Police Department suddenly found itself tasked with untangling years of fragmented, incomplete information, all while facing scrutiny about why it had taken so long to determine a pattern. One of the major issues early on was a lack of hard evidence. The remains of the Gilgo Four were skeletal when discovered, leaving few forensic leads to analyze. Without soft tissue, determination of time of death, manner of death, or even environmental clues was difficult. Even the burlap used to wrap the bodies, while distinctive, yielded no usable DNA or material evidence. Leads dried up quickly. Burner phones used to contact the women added a layer of anonymity for the killer, and their movements before disappearing left no surveillance footage or witness accounts to pinpoint their final moments. Investigators combed through records, but the tools available in 2010 could not discern much from scattered digital signals. The gaps left holes big enough to stall the case indefinitely. In the months after the discovery, Suffolk County Police expanded their search around Gilgo Beach and along Ocean Parkway, uncovering additional bodies. These remains included victims who did not fit the same profile as the Gilgo Four: a toddler, an unidentified man, and women whose connections to the original cases were not clear. The public started to grapple with the idea that Long Island had become a dumping ground, but even as the body count rose, no solid clues emerged. The possibility of multiple killers, either working simultaneously or over time, complicated the focus of the investigation. This uncertainty made it challenging to determine whether similar victims should even be attributed to one person. Adding to these difficulties was Suffolk County's internal turmoil. In 2011, James Burke became the new chief of police, and his leadership would prove to be a pivotal, albeit controversial, factor in the investigation's future or lack thereof. Burke quickly came under scrutiny for withholding information, sidelining experienced officers, and failing to cooperate with federal agencies like the FBI. Key evidence that could have benefited from broader expertise remained within Suffolk County's jurisdiction, effectively cut off from the additional resources it needed. To make matters worse, Burke himself became embroiled in legal scandals, including allegations of abuse of power and obstruction of justice. His tenure created a culture of mistrust within the department, derailing any sense of cohesion among investigative teams. By the time he resigned in 2015, years of missteps and distractions had left the case colder than ever. The lack of technological advancements at the time also hindered progress. In 2010, cell phone data analysis was still in its early stages compared to today's capabilities. The records available from the burner phones used to lure the victims lacked the precision to pinpoint the killer's location or identity. This gap created a timeline where investigators could only piece together fragments of movement. Cell towers pinged in areas like Massapequa Park, but they revealed no specifics. Similarly, advances in DNA analysis were not fully available during the initial years of the investigation. Hair strands, fibers, and other materials found among the victims remained unanalyzed until later, when improved technology finally gave them renewed relevance. In the meantime, though, these potential breakthroughs sat in evidence lockers, collecting dust. As the years dragged on, public frustration swelled. Families of the victims felt abandoned, often expressing anger at how law enforcement had treated their loved ones from the start. For Mari Gilbert, Shannon Gilbert's mother, the lack of action from authorities felt like a reflection of how society viewed women like Shannon and the rest of the Gilgo Four. Their work as escorts seemed to diminish the urgency of their cases in the eyes of the police, a reality that Mari confronted openly and repeatedly. If this was someone else's daughter, she argued in interviews, they would have done something sooner. Advocacy groups and media outlets began picking up on this sentiment, pointing out the systemic neglect of sex workers and other marginalized individuals in missing persons cases. The disparities in investigative priorities were glaring, further eroding trust between the community and law enforcement. In the absence of tangible progress, rumors and speculation filled the void. The idea that a serial killer was still active grew into an ominous undercurrent of fear. By 2015, 5 years after the first bodies were uncovered, there was no confirmed suspect, no arrest, and no discernible progress. Residents of Long Island began to wonder if the killer was someone they knew, a neighbor, a co-worker, perhaps even someone in a position of authority. The lack of resolution cast a shadow over the quiet coastal community. Every unsolved disappearance or tragic death of a woman along the eastern seaboard fueled theories that the Long Island serial killer could be responsible. Competing priorities within law enforcement also contributed to the case's stagnation. Suffolk County officers were often juggling multiple investigations, from organized crime to drug-related offenses, and the resources dedicated to the Gilgo Beach case were sometimes stretched thin. In some years, staffing levels for cold case units were insufficient to handle such a sprawling and complex investigation. Without progress, the case began slipping further down the list of priorities. This dynamic left families feeling as though their loved ones' stories were being forgotten, lost in the shuffle of bureaucratic delays and shifting leadership. So, as the investigation stalled, the narrative became one of missed opportunities and fading hope. The prospect of the killer striking again lingered in the minds of victims' families and the public alike. And while officials occasionally released vague updates about reviewing evidence or reopening leads, these efforts never seemed to materialize into anything concrete. Interviews with officials often came across as speculative rather than informative, further leaving the community in the dark. By the mid-2010s, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer felt frozen in time, trapped between outdated evidence and systemic flaws. Even with new technology rolling out, it seemed Suffolk County was slow to apply it to the case. This paralysis only deepened the fears that the killer might still be active, perhaps adapting to evade detection in an age when digital footprints were harder to erase. The haunting possibility of a predator still lurking heightened the emotional weight of the case, turning it into a spectre that loomed over Long Island. For the families, though, this was not about fear or speculation, it was about justice. Yet justice seemed farther away than ever. Despite the overwhelming sense of hopelessness, something shifted in the late 2010s. New leadership, fresh perspectives, and advancements in forensic technology began to breathe life back into the Gilgo Beach case. After a decade of silence, the Suffolk County Police Department announced renewed efforts to review evidence with a focus on modern methodologies. Items once deemed insignificant, including burner phone data, fibers, and hairs, were revisited with the latest tools, offering promise where none had existed before. By 2020, whispers of progress began to emerge, hinting that the years of waiting might not have been in vain. The question hanging in the air remained: could time and innovation unlock the secrets of a case that had confounded investigators for so long? Though the past decade provided few answers, it was becoming clear that the story of the Long Island serial killer was not over. For the first time in years, hope flickered on the horizon. After years of frustration and dead ends, the formation of a new task force in February 2022 marked a critical turning point in the Long Island serial killer investigation. This renewed effort was spearheaded by Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison and Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney. Their goal was clear: to apply modern technology, fresh perspectives, and focused resources to a case that had grown stagnant since the discovery of the Gilgo 4 more than a decade earlier. The task force wasted no time. One of their first steps was a meticulous review of old case files, many of which had been scattered or underutilized during earlier investigative efforts. Over the years, leads had been overlooked and connections remained unexamined, but with technological advances that weren't available when the investigation began, the team now had tools to analyze evidence in ways that had been impossible in the past. This detailed approach brought long-forgotten details back into focus, details that would soon prove essential to identifying a suspect. A pivotal clue came from Amber Costello's case, specifically the account provided by her roommate, Dave Schaller. Back in 2010, Schaller had described the man Amber went to meet on the night she disappeared, recalling his intimidating stature and a face he said was like an ogre. Schaller also remembered something most wouldn't. The man had driven a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. While this detail had been noted in the investigation's early stages, it didn't lead anywhere at the time. Now, the task force saw potential in this detail, narrowing their search for anyone who fit the description and owned that particular vehicle model. At the same time, investigators turned their attention to phone records, an area where technology had vastly improved since the early years of the case. The use of burner phones to contact victims like Melissa Barthélemy had been a hallmark of the killer's tactics, keeping his activities hidden behind layers of anonymity. However, when the task force analyzed those phone records again, patterns began to emerge. They noticed a concentration of activity linked to a specific geographic area, Massapequa Park, Long Island. This small zone, nicknamed the Box, became a focal point for investigators, narrowing their search for suspects and resources. The combination of these two key details, the Chevrolet Avalanche and the geographic phone data, soon pointed the task force to a name that had never before come up in connection to the case. Rex Heuermann, a local architect, Heuermann lived and worked in Massapequa Park, right in the center of the area flagged by the burner phone activities. His profile raised immediate interest. Here was a man whose unassuming life and professional success allowed him to operate unnoticed while living close to the area where the victims' remains were found. The more investigators dug into his background, the more the pieces began to fit. With this new lead, the task force initiated surveillance on Heuermann to observe his behavior and gather further evidence. One key moment came when investigators spotted him entering a cell phone store, Hoyman made a payment on one of his burner phones, a critical mistake that gave investigators additional proof of his connection to the devices used to lure the Gilgo 4. This simple act of paying for the phone confirmed a direct link between him and the tools that tied him to the crimes. As investigators closed in on Hoyman, they also revisited evidence collected from the crime scenes. One significant breakthrough involved previously recovered hair. Early forensic examinations had been unable to extract usable DNA from the hair strands found near Megan Waterman's remains. However, with advancements in mitochondrial DNA analysis, these hairs could now be re-examined. The results linked the male hair found at the scene to Hoyman, further anchoring suspicions surrounding his involvement. What made the case even more damning was the connection between Hoyman's personal movements and the burner phone activity. Each time a victim was contacted, the burner phone pinged off cell towers in Massapequa Park. Investigators matched this activity to Hoyman's work and residence locations. It was a pattern not easily explained away by coincidence. As this trail unfolded, more connections emerged, links between his technology use, his geographic footprint, and his potential access to a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. These revelations created a ripple effect for the families of the victims. For years, they had waited in agony, wondering if there would ever be answers. When news broke that a suspect had finally been identified, hope reignited among those closest to the case. For once, it feels like they're looking in the right direction, one family member said, expressing both relief and cautious optimism. Yet, even as they grasped for hope, the fear of another false start lingered in their minds. Would this be the moment when answers finally arrived, or would the trail go cold once again? By the summer of 2023, the task force gathered enough evidence to move forward decisively. The Chevrolet Avalanche, once a tiny detail buried in case files, became a cornerstone. Combined with the DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and detailed records of burner phone usage, investigators had built a solid case against Hoyman. And it wasn't just his connection to the 4 women buried along Gilgo Beach. It was his actions, his deliberate planning, and the undeniable traces linking him to the scenes of these crimes. Rex Hoyman was arrested in July 2023 in what became a monumental moment for one of the most elusive serial killer investigations in modern history. The evidence against him was staggering, shifting the investigation from years of uncertainty to solid ground. For the first time in over a decade, the families of the victims could begin to envision something they had almost given up hope on: justice. However, the arrest brought its own wave of questions and challenges. Would the evidence be enough to secure a conviction? And could Hoyman be tied to other victims previously found near Gilgo Beach? This arrest wasn't the conclusion. It signaled the beginning of a new phase. Investigators and prosecutors now faced the daunting task of building a case strong enough to stand in court. Meanwhile, the community that had been haunted by this case for so long wrestled with the realization that the suspect had lived among them all along. As the investigation began its next chapter, one thing became clear. The brutal crimes along Gilgo Beach had finally been pulled back into the spotlight, no longer buried by years of oversight and missed opportunities. Justice, though late, felt one step closer. Rex Hoyman appeared to be an ordinary man. A successful architect based in New York City, he ran his own firm out of an office in Midtown Manhattan. From the outside, his life seemed steady and unremarkable. He lived quietly in Massapequa Park, a residential town on Long Island, not far from the sandy stretches of beach that had become infamous for reasons few could comprehend. This proximity, both to the crime scenes and to the heart of New York City, was a fitting metaphor for how someone could live 2 lives, one visible, one hidden in the shadows. To those who worked with him professionally, Hoyman might have seemed like any other accomplished architect. But in 2023, evidence surfaced suggesting that behind the facade of suburban normality lay a devastating truth. The arrest of Rex Hoyman in July 2023 came after more than a decade of frustration and mystery surrounding the Gilgo Beach murders. All signs seemed to point to him as the elusive Long Island serial killer. Investigators had finally connected him to the crimes through a series of findings: burner phone records, eyewitness descriptions, a specific type of vehicle, and, perhaps most damningly, forensic evidence. Years of silence had been broken by methodical detective work and advances in technology. And now, forgotten bits and pieces from an old case file were painting a picture that led directly to Hoyman. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was the burner phones. The killer had a history of using disposable cell phones to contact his victims, women who worked as escorts and advertised their services online. These phones were shielded by anonymity, leaving little for investigators to track in the early 2010s. However, when Suffolk County's new task force reviewed this data with modern tools, a pattern began to emerge. The phones used to lure victims like Melissa Barthelemy and Amber Costello had repeatedly pinged cell towers near Massapequa Park, Hoyerman's hometown. This tiny detail trained the investigation's sights on a very small area, and on Hoyerman, who lived and worked within the range of those signals. It was a crack in the killer's armor, one that slowly began to widen. Another key piece of evidence was the first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. This vehicle first came to investigators' attention over a decade earlier, during the investigation into Amber Costello's disappearance. On the night she vanished, Amber told her roommate she was heading to meet a client who had offered an unusually high payment, $500 in cash. The roommate, Dave Schaller, later described the client as an enormous man who resembled an ogre and drove a Chevy Avalanche. It was this detail, buried in early reports, that the task force dusted off when they reopened the case files. They discovered that during the time of the murders, Hoyerman had been the registered owner of such a vehicle. This connection was crucial not only because it matched Schaller's description, but because the car itself was later found on Hoyerman's property in South Carolina. After so many years, the Avalanche had resurfaced, providing a direct link between Hoyerman's identity and Amber Costello's final client. Still, nothing was more conclusive than the DNA evidence. Investigators had recovered a male hair near Megan Waterman's remains, found wrapped in burlap and buried along Gilgo Beach. For years, this piece of evidence had been analysed, but yielded no results due to limitations in forensic technology. By 2023, mitochondrial DNA analysis had advanced enough to make more precise matches possible. But to connect the hair to Hoyerman, detectives needed a contemporary DNA sample from him. This brought them to Midtown Manhattan. Investigators followed Hoyerman closely, waiting for the right opportunity to obtain his DNA without his knowledge. The moment came when they spotted him discarding a pizza box in a trash can. It was a routine act, something anyone might do during an average workday. But for the task force, it represented the breakthrough they needed. From that discarded pizza crust, detectives extracted DNA and compared it to the profile obtained from the hair found with Megan Waterman's remains. The results were unmistakable. The DNA from the pizza and the DNA from the crime scene were a match. Years of uncertainty gave way to a hard link between Hoyerman and the murders. As damning as this evidence seemed, investigators were careful to build their case even further. They retraced every possible connection, overlaying Hoyerman's movements, phone records, and known associates against the timeline of the murders. They discovered that many of the burner phones used to contact the victims had been purchased in New York City, an area Hoyerman frequented for work. Payment records also tied back to him, solidifying his use of these devices and their role in coordinating meetings with his victims. News of his arrest on July 14, 2023, sent shockwaves across Long Island and far beyond. Hoyerman was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He was not immediately charged in connection with Maureen Brainard Barnes's death, though prosecutors named him as the prime suspect in her case as well. The focused charges suggested that law enforcement was intent on building a rock-solid case rather than overextending prematurely. Still, there was growing speculation about the other bodies found along Gilgo Beach and whether Hoyerman might be connected to more of them. Following his arrest, police executed extensive searches of Hoyerman's Massapequa Park home. Forensic teams combed through the property for 12 days, removing boxes of evidence and even digging in the backyard for potential additional remains or belongings tied to the victims. The Chevrolet Avalanche was seized, taken into custody as a piece of critical evidence in his alleged crimes. At the time of his arrest, Hoyerman also owned property in South Carolina and Las Vegas, both locations that have now become focal points for ongoing investigations to determine whether there may be other victims or if further evidence could be tied to those addresses. Hoyerman pleaded not guilty to the charges against him during his arraignment in Suffolk County Court. His defense team wasted no time in casting doubt on the evidence presented by prosecutors. His attorney, Michael Brown, stated publicly, "What has my client told me? He told me he didn't do this." Despite these claims, prosecutors stood firm, bolstered by the DNA match obtained both from the pizza crust and through a cheek swab administered after his arrest. As of September 27, 2023, this DNA had been reconfirmed in court as consistent with the hair recovered from the crime scene. Still, questions remain. Is the evidence enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? The DNA match and circumstantial connections, burner phones, vehicle records, and witness descriptions give the prosecution a strong foundation. But, as any seasoned detective knows, trials hinge on how clearly a narrative can be delivered to a jury. Defense attorneys are likely to attack the reliability of some connections, focusing on the gaps caused by the passage of time. Meanwhile, The community that once felt haunted by an invisible threat now wrestles with the idea that the killer may have been hiding in plain sight. Hoyerman lived just miles from one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern history. He went to work, came home, and existed among neighbors who likely never suspected a thing. For those who followed the case for years, the gradual reveal of his life and movements evokes more unease than relief. Though the arrest of Rex Hoyerman answered many long-standing questions about the Long Island serial killer, it also reopened the door to a disturbing consideration. If he was responsible for these crimes, might there still be others? Investigators are now faced with determining whether his arrest marks the end of the case or merely another step in unraveling a twisted story that has haunted Long Island for over a decade. In May 2011, a chilling discovery brought the investigation at Gilgo Beach into even murkier territory. During an expanded search, law enforcement uncovered 6 additional sets of remains scattered along the same stretch of coastline. This brought the known total to 10 bodies, including the Gilgo 4, while the first 4 victims followed a clear, disturbing pattern. Young, petite women working as escorts. The aftermath of this discovery raised an unsettling question. Were all these victims tied to the same killer, or had the shoreline become a dumping ground for other predators operating in the shadows? Among the additional remains was Jessica Taylor, a 20-year-old escort from Washington, D.C., who had disappeared in 2003. Jessica's partial remains were first found that same year, over 40 miles away, in Manorville, Long Island. A torso had been discovered, left in the woods, but investigators could not identify her at the time. 8 years later, other parts of Jessica's body were found closer to Gilgo Beach. It was now clear that she had been one of the killer's targets, though the dispersion of her remains raised questions about the methods and motives behind her murder. Then came the discovery of Valerie Mack, also known as Jane Doe 6, until her identification in 2020 through DNA testing. Valerie, an escort and 24 years old at the time of her disappearance in 2000, had also been last seen in the Philadelphia area. Like Jessica Taylor, her remains were split between Manorville and Gilgo Beach. This distinctive pattern, partial torsos left inland, while other remains were deposited closer to the coastline, seemed to suggest a shift or evolution in the killer's behavior. Yet, it wasn't clear if this was intentional symbolism, a logistical decision, or something else entirely. Both cases hinted at more than one method of disposal, complicating efforts to link all the evidence to a single suspect. The diversity among the additional remains added further confusion to the case. One victim, known as Peaches, due to a tattoo of a peach found on her torso in 1997, would later be genetically confirmed as the mother of a toddler girl whose skeletal remains were also discovered near Gilgo Beach. A bond as intimate as motherhood made these cases particularly haunting. Yet both Peaches and her child remain unidentified, 2 victims whose stories have eluded both investigators and the public. Neither their connection to Hoyerman nor to any other suspect has been established. Even more perplexing was the discovery of an unidentified Asian male dressed in women's clothing. Authorities theorized that this individual might have been targeted for reasons unrelated to the others, potentially pointing to a wider range of victims or a more complex psychological driver behind these murders. Unlike the other remains, the male's cause of death appeared consistent with blunt force trauma, adding a disturbing new element to the killer's potential methods. Was this part of the same pattern, or a completely separate act of violence that just happened to end along the same shores? One of the oldest remains found belonged to Karen Vergata, another woman who had worked as an escort. Karen disappeared in 1996, and for decades she was known only as Jane Doe 7, until her identification was confirmed in 2023. Her presence among the victims drew the timeline of the case even further back in time, suggesting crimes that could span decades. If Hoyerman was responsible, had he begun killing in the mid-1990s? And if so, could there be even more crimes linked to him, predating or overlapping with these discoveries? The very fact that these victims lived different lives and disappeared at different times has led many experts to question whether there might be more than one killer. The Suffolk County Police Department raised this possibility early on, acknowledging that the disparities in victim profiles and methods of disposal could point to unrelated cases. Alternatively, they theorized, one person might have been responsible by tailoring their actions to evade detection. Forensic experts have even debated the mental profile of a potential suspect or suspects. Could one person's motive encompass this broad range of victims and methods? Or were multiple predators exploiting the same vulnerabilities and dumping ground? Complicating matters, investigators have since broadened their focus to encompass Rex Hoyerman's life outside Long Island. After his arrest in July 2023, detectives began examining properties he owned in other states, including South Carolina and Las Vegas. In South Carolina, investigators searched Hoyerman's property for possible evidence linked to other unsolved cases. Through their thorough examination, officials have removed boxes of potential forensic materials, though they have not disclosed specific findings. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, cold case detectives have reviewed missing persons reports and homicides, probing the possibility that Hoyerman committed additional crimes while traveling for work or personal reasons. The effort to connect Hoyerman to other crimes remains ongoing. While no additional charges have been filed as of yet, law enforcement across multiple states has taken a renewed interest in cold cases that share similarities with the murders near Gilgo Beach. Whether these efforts turn up hard evidence remains unclear, but the sheer scope of the investigations signals the gravity of Hoyerman's potential crimes. How many lives did his path intertwine with, and how many families could finally gain closure, no matter how bitter? This uncertainty leaves the door open for future developments. If new evidence emerges, prosecutors could bring further charges against Hoyerman. For the families whose loved ones remain unidentified among the Gilgo victims, this provides a slim but important hope that their stories might still find resolution. As one official remarked during the 2023 press briefings, the case remains very active. While prosecutors have focused on securing a conviction in the murders of the Gilgo Four, they continue to track leads on the identities of other victims and investigate how deeply Hoyerman's darkness may have run. Even now, some victims remain nameless, their identities reduced to placeholders like Jane Doe, 3, or Peaches. Their lives, while faded from memory, are far from forgotten. The families of the unidentified victims continue to live in limbo, waiting for the phone call or DNA match that could finally replace unknown with a name. For every breakthrough, there remains a stretch of time where silence weighs heavier than answers. Without definitive connections tying all 10 bodies to one person, the puzzle of who else could be involved lingers like a shadow over the investigation. In many ways, the Long Island serial killer case stands as a stark reminder of the challenges in untangling crimes that span decades. It highlights not just the acts of the predator or predators, but also the systemic failings that allowed these killings to go unchecked for so long. Weaknesses in earlier investigations, combined with less advanced forensic techniques and societal dismissiveness of sex workers, created an environment where a killer could thrive in anonymity. Even now, as modern technology has cracked critical pieces of the puzzle, investigators find themselves racing against an ever-lengthening timeline filled with gaps and uncertainties. Though Rex Hoyerman has been arrested, his guilt in these murders is not yet determined by the courts, and even if a conviction is secured, the case itself may never truly close. The discovery of additional bodies near Gilgo Beach hints at a far broader story, one that may stretch further back, encompass other suspects, or involve unspeakable acts not yet unearthed. Could there still be another, as-yet unseen predator out there? Or do the answers lie solely within Hoyerman's dark double life? For now, we're left with fragments of a still unfinished story. The search for justice remains active, but so do the lingering mysteries. Mysteries that haunt not just the shores of Long Island, but families, communities, and investigators who refuse to let these victims fade into obscurity. This case, far from being resolved, continues to remind us just how many secrets the sands of Gilgo Beach might still hold. The families of the Gilgo Four, the women whose lives were cut short and whose remains were discovered along Gilgo Beach, have endured a long and painful wait for answers. Their grief has been compounded by years of delays, missteps, and the lingering feeling that the system underestimated the urgency of their loved ones' cases. For these families, closure has felt like an elusive promise, always out of reach, yet desperately needed. Missy Cann remembers the night her sister Maureen Brainerd Barnes called for the last time. It was late July in 2007, and Maureen, ever the big sister, had been trying to assure Missy that everything was fine. She was calling from a payphone in New York City, from Penn Station to be exact, where she said she was planning to catch the midnight train home, but Maureen never boarded that train, and from that moment on, her voice was silenced. Missy's account of their final conversation highlights the heartbreak of those left behind, a sudden absence punctuated by endless questions. What happened after that call? Who did she meet? Why wasn't there an immediate response to find her? These are the questions that have haunted Missy throughout the years, shaping her efforts to keep Maureen's name in the public eye. For the families, the early years of the investigation were defined by frustration. Law enforcement's initial response to the women's disappearances often reflected dismissive attitudes, rooted in the stigma surrounding their work as escorts. Leads were slow to follow, and many families felt they weren't being taken seriously. This was exacerbated by the scattered jurisdictions from which each woman had gone missing. Megan Waterman disappeared from Long Island, and Melissa Barthélemy vanished from the Bronx, while Maureen Brainerd Barnes was last seen in Manhattan, and Amber Costello disappeared from a nearby Long Island suburb. This fragmentation meant police departments handled their cases separately, not yet realizing they were all connected to a much larger story. While the investigators struggled to piece things together, the families were left in limbo. Time stretched on with few updates, pushing these loved ones into a painful cycle of waiting and wondering. For Mari Gilbert, the mother of Shannon Gilbert, the refusal to accept law enforcement's lack of urgency became a defining battle. Mari refused to stay quiet, attending press conferences, contacting reporters, and publicly challenging local officials to give her daughter's case the attention it deserved. Even when faced with indifference or opposition, she pressed forward, often saying that she wouldn't rest until Shannon's true story was brought to light. Though Shannon's case differed from the Gilgo Four in key ways, the passion and determination Mari brought to her pursuit resonated with other grieving families, inspiring them to raise their voices in the face of extraordinary loss. For Megan Waterman's daughter, Liliana, the loss of her mother carries a different kind of weight. Liliana was only 3 years old when Megan disappeared, meaning she has spent her entire life trying to understand the person her mother was. During a television interview years later, Liliana expressed the thoughts that countless others must have felt: the simple desire to say "I love you" one more time. Her words, "I never got to really say those words," underline the profound ripple effect loss has on those who, because of age or circumstance, were never given closure. A lifetime of longing, shaped by questions that a child should never have to carry, marks Liliana's journey. The pain of losing a loved one was amplified by the idea that the killer might still be at large. Each passing year felt like another reminder that the system had failed. The families watched helplessly as public attention shifted away from their loved ones, as leads dried up and as hope waned. Yet through this, their voices remained constant, fighting against the tide to ensure the victims weren't forgotten. They spoke at media events, participated in documentaries, and partnered with advocacy groups to shine a renewed light on the case. This collective effort kept the women's stories alive, even when it seemed the investigation was losing ground. Advocacy groups played an essential role during the quiet years of the investigation. Organizations focused on helping families of crime victims worked to highlight the injustices many believed had plagued the handling of the case. They organized vigils, called for task forces, and pushed for transparency in the investigation. In the process, they helped amplify the families' voices, while pushing the broader narrative that sex workers, often marginalized and overlooked, deserve the same urgency and care in investigations as any other victim. For Missy Can, her openness about Maureen's life wasn't just an act of grieving, it became an act of defiance. Speaking about her sister's struggles with financial pressures and her decision to become an escort wasn't easy, but Missy believed it was necessary to humanize Maureen in the eyes of an often judgmental public. Whether through interviews or events, Missy ensured that Maureen wasn't reduced to a statistic, explaining that she was a devoted sister and an irreplaceable part of their family. Similarly, Melissa Barthélemy's teenage sister, Amanda, endured unimaginable trauma as the recipient of taunting calls made by the killer. Despite the horror, Amanda remained vocal about Melissa's disappearance, serving as a reminder of just how much the killer's crimes extended beyond the victims themselves, leaving behind an unrelenting aftermath. When Rex Heuermann was arrested in 2023, it marked a turning point for the victims' families. For over a decade, their lives had been in limbo, filled with unanswered questions and almost no resolution. While the capture of a suspect brought clarity to some aspects of the case, it didn't erase the pain of the years lost or the struggles endured. Families like Maureen's, Megan's, Melissa's, and Amber's now focus their energy on the next stage, the trial. They understand that while the arrest of Heuermann brought relief, it also marked the beginning of yet another challenging chapter in their efforts to see justice served. The legal process is rarely swift, and the wait for a trial has kept the families in a place of profound uncertainty. The burden grows heavier as details surrounding the crimes emerge, forcing them to relive some of the most painful moments of their lives. Still, their determination to honor their loved ones remains constant. This strength has been their unifying trait through years of accusation, delay, and uncertainty. Even with the potential for legal resolution, it's clear that justice won't bring these women back, nor will it truly close the gaping hole left in their families' lives. What it will do, however, is offer recognition of the lives they lived, the struggles they faced, and the unimaginable cruelty they suffered. Recognition that they mattered. The family's fight for justice hasn't just been about their own loved ones. It has also been about advocating for systemic change, calling attention to how investigations often overlook or deprioritize victims who come from marginalized backgrounds. They've reminded the public and law enforcement alike that every life has value, regardless of circumstance, and that every family deserves answers, no matter the obstacles. While the spotlight now shines on Hoyerman and the details of his alleged crimes, the families remain steadfast in reminding the world of what truly matters. The women whose lives were stolen, who were mothers, sisters, daughters, and friends. Those whose names might have been forgotten without the tireless work of those who loved them. For these families, the fight isn't over. It won't be over until justice is fully served, until every victim is identified, and until every question has an answer. While the process will undoubtedly stretch on into the future, one thing is certain: they will never stop fighting. Their perseverance has ensured that their loved ones' stories remain heard, and that silence will never again settle over the sands of Gilgo Beach. The Long Island serial killer case did more than shock a community. It called into question how society approaches the pursuit of justice for victims from vulnerable populations, and revealed the systemic blind spots that allowed a killer or killers to evade capture for so long. The lessons learned from this investigation stretch far beyond the beaches of Long Island. This case has left behind critical questions about policing, technology, and the way victims are treated in the legal system, all while reinforcing just how fragile the processes meant to protect individuals can be. The investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders became a study in the ripple effects of prioritization, or rather, a lack thereof. At the time the victims first began disappearing, their cases were handled with a disjointed urgency at best. Each woman's disappearance was seen as isolated and unconnected to the others, perhaps because their work as online escorts made them easy for some to dismiss as transient or inherently at risk. This tendency to deprioritize crimes involving sex workers remains one of the darkest themes of the case. Too often, law enforcement agencies rely on stereotypes when making decisions about which cases receive critical resources early on. The need for more equitable treatment and protection for marginalized communities within the criminal justice system has lingered at the heart of discussions surrounding Gilgo Beach. Many believe that had the victims fallen into a different demographic, the authorities might have acted sooner, shortening the killer's spree or saving lives. Beyond the victims' work or backgrounds, the fragmented nature of the resources used to investigate the disappearances raised additional challenges. With reports originating in vastly different jurisdictions, New York City, Maine, Connecticut, there was little collaboration at the start. Early coordination failures between police precincts allowed critical patterns to go unnoticed until it was too late to intervene. It was only after the discovery of remains along Gilgo Beach that agencies began working together, but the years of delay leading up to that point exposed flaws in communication and resource sharing, not just at the local or state level, but across federal lines as well. The eventual involvement of the FBI, particularly in analyzing phone records and helping identify technology-based evidence, highlighted how crucial cross-jurisdictional collaboration can be, especially where serial crimes or cold cases are concerned. The significance of modern forensic technology cannot be overstated in this case. The breakthroughs that ultimately connected Rex Hoyerman to the murders depended on advancements that weren't available when the first bodies were discovered. Forensic science had evolved considerably in the years since 2010. The hair recovered from the burlap wrap near Megan Waterman's body sat dormant in evidence lockers for years, powerless to lead investigators to a suspect. But with improvements in mitochondrial DNA analysis, it became possible to match that sample to Hoyerman in 2023, bringing perhaps the most damning evidence to the forefront. Similarly, the use of a discarded pizza crust to confirm a DNA link underscores the importance of such techniques in ensuring cold cases are not forgotten. It's moments like these that remind investigators and the public how critical investment in forensic science truly is. Without it, many long unsolved cases would remain locked in the past. Technology also played a central role in tracing Hoyerman's digital activities. The killer's use of burner phones had once seemed like an unbreakable shield, frustrating investigators who lacked the tools to track these devices in real time. Years later, advancements in cell tower data analysis enabled authorities to re-examine the information, pinpointing connections between the burner phones and the Massapequa Park area where Hoyerman lived. This breakthrough turned what had once been a dead end into a major lead, ultimately tightening the net around the suspect. Yet, the investigation also revealed a deeper challenge, balancing the benefits of technological access with privacy concerns. Burner phones remain a grey area in law enforcement, with debates ongoing about how these tools might be regulated in the future to aid similar investigations while respecting individual rights. The societal implications of the Long Island case extend beyond the forensic or technological. It forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about how vulnerable populations are treated by the justice system and by society as a whole. The stigma surrounding the victim's profession didn't just hinder public perception. In some cases, it slowed the very process of searching for them. Missing person reports for sex workers are too often overlooked or treated as lower priority cases, particularly when adults are involved. This perception of lifestyle risk creates a bias that can leave sex workers and other marginalized groups especially vulnerable to violent crime. In response to such issues, victim advocacy groups have pushed for more nuanced investigations that avoid moral judgment while focusing on the human lives at stake. The Long Island case serves as a stark reminder of how dangerous it can be to allow societal biases to creep into criminal investigations. Another valuable takeaway is the critical role victim advocacy and community voices can play in keeping a case alive. During the years when the investigation stagnated, it was the victims' families and evolving media coverage that kept the case in the public eye. Families of the Gilgo Four, in particular, refused to let their loved ones disappear without a fight, maintaining pressure on law enforcement by keeping their stories visible. The families worked with advocacy groups to raise awareness around the lack of urgency in the earlier stages of the investigation. This persistence paid off in 2022 with the formation of a new task force, bringing fresh eyes to the case and reigniting traction toward justice. It's a powerful reminder that when systems falter, communities and especially families have the ability to push for accountability and results. The Long Island serial killer case also demonstrates the importance of understanding how predators exploit new tools. In this instance, the killer's use of online platforms to locate, contact, and lure victims underscores the dangers such technologies can enable. Craigslist, a platform once unregulated and widely used for escort advertisements, provided anonymity that worked in the killer's favor. Situations like these have sparked wider conversations about improving safety in online environments, especially for users working in high-risk industries. While policymakers tread carefully to avoid infringing on legitimate uses of such platforms, the need for safeguards remains a growing focus area for public safety advocates. At its core, this case raises one of the most uncomfortable questions. Have we learned enough to prevent something like this from happening again? The advancements in technology and collaboration that ultimately led to a suspect's arrest are undeniably encouraging, but they don't guarantee a foolproof system going forward. Serial crimes, by their nature, exploit systemic vulnerabilities. If more emphasis isn't placed on early red flags, disappearances that might seem isolated at first but point to a larger pattern, it's all too easy for dangerous individuals to operate undisturbed. In reflecting on this case, officers, policymakers, and advocates alike continue to weigh what still needs to change in the years ahead. Finally, this case underscores the need to support not only investigations but the recovery of those left behind. The trauma faced by the victims' families is a crucial, often overlooked part of the story. Groups that offer advocacy, counseling, and restorative services to grieving loved ones have reported the far-reaching impact of such violent crimes. The families of the victims have faced immense emotional and psychological trauma, as noted, and this case brought to light the ongoing need for more robust services to meet those needs. Public awareness campaigns fueled by the case have also shone a spotlight on these challenges, emphasizing the importance of funding for grief support and victim advocacy organizations. When we look back at the Long Island case, it serves as much more than a chapter in true crime history. It's a cautionary tale about the cost of oversight, the power of persistence, and the fragility of protections for the most vulnerable. For those involved, there are no neat conclusions, but every advancement in the case, even one as long delayed as the eventual arrest of Rex Hoyerman, underscores the importance of collective effort. From families refusing to give up, to scientists applying cutting-edge tools to uncover hidden truths, these efforts serve as a reminder that while justice may be slow, it's no less critical for the victims whose stories demand to be told. And for future cases yet to come, this legacy carries an urgent message. No victim should ever be dismissed, no matter their circumstances, and no case should ever rest while questions remain unanswered. The Long Island serial killer case stands as a stark reminder of the importance of persistence. Early missteps and the marginalization of vulnerable victims, like the Gilgo Four, stalled progress for years. But the tireless determination of families, advocacy groups, and investigators ensured the search for justice endured. The need for more equitable treatment and protection for marginalized communities within the criminal justice system remains clear even now. This case highlights the power of renewed effort and evolving technology, offering hope for other unsolved cases. Stay informed, share these stories, and support initiatives that amplify the voices of the forgotten.